Her father's hand was rough and cold from digging, but the wall he pressed it against was not. January, and 2 feet of snow above them, and the cellar stone felt like September. He held her palm flat beside his. She was 9. She could smell lime and damp and candle smoke, and somewhere behind them a sack of potatoes that should have frozen but had not. "The earth is slower than the weather," he said. "Everything above the ground is arguing with the sky. Everything below it has already made up its mind." 30 years later, with no house, no money, and a daughter coughing in a shed the wind was pulling apart, she pressed her hand against a clay bank and felt the same stillness her father had shown her, and understood for the first time what he had been trying to teach. October 26, 1887. Eliza Martin stood in the yard of the farm that had been hers until an hour ago, holding a deed to 40 acres of rock and clay that nobody wanted and $9.70 that would not last until November. Ruth stood beside her, 15 years old, hands balled inside coat pockets that had no lining left. She had not cried when the deputy read the paper. She had not cried when he told them sunset was the limit. She had picked up the cracked blue cup from the table, wrapped it in a rag, and put it in the flour sack with the salt tin and the last of the dried beans. That was Ruth. She did not waste motion on things she could not change. Thomas Martin had been dead 18 months. A threshing accident on the coop place. A drive belt snapped, caught his sleeve, pulled his arm into the cylinder before anyone could cut the power. He lived 4 days, long enough to tell Eliza about the grazing parcel he had bought on credit the year before. 40 acres of rocky draw above a dry creek bed 4 miles outside Broken Bow. He had paid $11 down and owed 32 more. He said it would be good pasture once the stones were cleared. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about several things, but he was not wrong about Eliza. She had held the farm together for a year after his death, managing the planting, the haying, the harvest. 2 poor years running. Wheat prices falling. The banknote Thomas had signed carried interest that compounded quarterly, and the numbers moved in one direction only, $186.40. That was the sum printed on the paper the deputy had carried. It might as well have said 1,000. The wagon team was gone, taken as collateral 6 weeks earlier when Eliza missed the September payment. Her nearest family was a sister in eastern Iowa, 300 miles of rail away. 2 fares plus freight for the stove and tools would cost more than everything she had, and arriving would mean becoming dependent kin in a house already crowded with 5 children and a brother-in-law who had never liked Thomas. Eliza did not intend to become dependent kin. She loaded the flour sack, 2 quilts, the iron stove with its cracked collar, the Dutch oven, 2 shovels, 1 mattock head without a handle, and a coil of baling wire onto a borrowed handcart. A neighbor named Pell, no relation to the deputy, common surname in the county, let her use it until morning. She did not ask for more. The 40-acre parcel was 4 miles south and east. They walked it in the dark, Ruth pulling one side of the cart and Eliza pushing the other, the stove clanging against the shovels at every rut. The road was frozen hard enough to walk on, but not hard enough to be kind. Twice the cart tilted. Once a wheel dropped into a washed-out gully, and Ruth had to lift the back end while Eliza dragged it forward. Ruth did not complain. She counted steps instead. She told Eliza later she had counted 4,600 before she stopped keeping track. They arrived at the parcel in full dark. There was a claim shed, if you could call it that, 3 walls of cottonwood slabs nailed to crooked posts. 1 wall of canvas stretched over a frame that had warped in 2 seasons of weather. The roof was split shakes over sagging rafters. The door was a plank hung on leather hinges. Inside, dirt floor, mouse droppings, the smell of old hay and rot, and a darkness so complete that the lantern flames seemed to pull inward instead of pushing out. Ruth set the flour sack on the floor. She looked at the walls. She looked at the canvas that moved when the wind pressed it. She said, "How long do we have?" Eliza said, "Until winter." Ruth said, "How long is that?" 6 weeks, maybe 7. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is not enough." She was right. And that was the arithmetic that would govern every hour of the next 43 days. A conventional cabin, the kind Hiram Vale built, required a full sill of squared timber, wall studs, roof rafters, tar paper, shakes or sod for the roof, nails by the keg, glass for at least one window, and 2 men working full days for 3 weeks. Vale knew this because he had built 9 of them. He was 62 years old, former Army carpenter, and the man people in the valley called when they needed something measured correctly. He wore a steel square in his coat pocket the way other men wore a flask. Vale arrived at the Marden parcel at dawn on October 28th. Nobody had asked him to come. He came because Mercy Cole had mentioned at the store that the Marden widow and her girl were camped on the old grazing claim, and Vale did not like the sound of that. He was not a sentimental man, he was a precise one. And precision meant understanding what was survivable and what was not. He walked the property with his hands clasped behind his back. He looked at the claim shed and did not bother going inside. He looked at the wood pile, less than half a cord of cottonwood, some of it green, none of it split to stove length. He looked at the terrain, rocky draw, dry creek bed to the east, and to the south-southeast, a clay embankment rising maybe 14 feet above the drainage, reddish soil streaked with blue-gray bands, scrub willow at the base, buffalo grass on the flat above. He looked at all of it the way a doctor looks at a patient he already knows will not recover. Then he found Eliza. She was behind the shed, trying to straighten the mattock head by wedging it onto a cottonwood branch. The branch kept splitting. She had wrapped it with baling wire twice. The wire held, but the head wobbled. Vale watched her swing it twice. Then he said, "Mrs. Marden." She stopped. She did not look embarrassed. She looked at him the way she might have looked at weather, something to be assessed, not avoided. "Mr. Vale, you cannot winter here." "I am aware of what I cannot do. I have a list." Vale did not smile. He pulled the square from his pocket and held it against the shed's corner post. The post was 3 inches off plumb. He let the square hang there for a moment, then put it back. "A cabin," he said. 16 by 20. That is the minimum for 2 people with a stove that does not freeze the water bucket. You need a full sill, peeled logs, squared on 2 faces. You need studs every 24 inches. You need rafters, ridgepole, tar paper, shakes. I will not even speak about a floor. Eliza waited. $60 in lumber, that is before freight. $12 in nails, hinges, and a stove collar that does not leak smoke into the room where you sleep. 3 cords of fuel to reach March, 5 if winter comes hard. You would need 2 men besides yourself, working full days, and 3 weeks of weather that does not rain or freeze. He paused. He was not being cruel. He was counting the way he always counted. You have a clay bank. You have no rafters. You have 2 women and 1 stove that leaks smoke. That is not a house, Mrs. Marden. That is a delay. Eliza absorbed this. She did not argue with the numbers. She had already run them herself and arrived at the same wall. Ruth came around the corner of the shed. She had been listening. She asked Vale whether they could sleep in the shed through winter if they patched the canvas and banked earth against the outside walls. Vale looked at the shed. He walked to the weak wall and pressed his boot against the lowest slab. His foot went through the rotted wood up to the ankle. He pulled it out, brushed the splinters off, and said, "A north wind will peel this apart before Christmas. The canvas will go first, then the roof, then you." Ruth's face did not change. She was Thomas's daughter in that way. She took information and filed it without flinching, but Eliza saw her jaw tighten. Vale turned to leave. He had said what he came to say. He was not offering help. He was offering a verdict, delivered with the same accuracy he brought to framing a door. Eliza said, "Mr. Vale." He stopped. "How deep does frost go here?" Vale frowned. "Depends on the winter. 2 feet in a mild one, 3 or 4 in a hard one. Why?" "Just asking." "It is not a useful question, Mrs. Martin. Frost depth does not build walls." He mounted his horse and rode north without looking back. Ruth watched him go. Then she looked at her mother. Eliza was not looking at Vale. She was looking at the clay bank. That night, the wind came from the northwest and pressed the canvas wall inward until it touched Ruth's shoulder where she lay. The stovepipe joint leaked. Smoke crawled along the ceiling and settled into their blankets. Ruth coughed until she vomited into a tin basin. Eliza held her hair back and then took the basin outside and emptied it in the dark. When she came back in, she mixed mud and flour paste in her palm and packed it around the stovepipe joint where the collar had cracked. The smoke thinned, but did not stop entirely. It never would, not in this shed. The iron was warped, and warped iron did not forgive. Ruth fell asleep sitting up against the back wall, her coat pulled over her knees. Eliza sat beside her and pressed her hand flat against the packed clay behind the shed's rear slabs. The clay was cold, but it was not the cold of the air. The air outside had a teeth edge to it, a sharpness that bit the inside of the nose and made the eyes water. The clay was a different cold, dense, slow, resistant. It did not attack. It merely held its own temperature, indifferent to what the sky was doing. Eliza kept her hand there for a long time. She thought about her father. Martin Weller had dug canals and cellars in Mifflin County, Pennsylvania. Eliza was 9 when he took her into the root cellar beneath their house in January and pressed her hand against the stone wall. The wall was cool, but not cold. Above them, snow lay 2 feet deep. The creek was frozen solid, but the cellar wall felt like September. Her father said, "The earth is slower than the weather, Eliza. The air changes its mind every hour. The ground does not." He showed her the potatoes stored against that wall. Sound. Firm. No frost damage. The carrots in their sand bin. The crock of sauerkraut that had not frozen despite 3 weeks of bitter cold above. "Everything above the ground is arguing with the sky," he said. "Everything below it has already made up its mind." She had filed that away the way Ruth filed things, without drama, without understanding the full weight of what she had been given. A fact about temperature, a thing her father knew from years of digging. Now she sat in a rotting shed in Custer County, Nebraska, with a sick daughter and $9.70, and the memory surfaced like a stone turned up by a plow. The problem was not warmth. Warmth was a stove, and they had a stove. The problem was exposure. A freestanding cabin, the kind Vale described, presented 4 walls and a roof to the wind. Every surface was a place for cold to attack. The wind found gaps, pressed through chinking, pulled heat through boards like thread through cloth. A cabin fought the weather on every side and lost slowly, steadily, cord by cord of wood fed into a stove that could never keep pace. A dugout did not fight. A dugout refused to participate. It gave the wind nothing to grip, no walls to press against, no roof to lift, no corners to pry at. The only exposed surface was the front, and if the front was low and angled and tucked into the bank, even that presented almost nothing. Eliza stood up. She went outside with the lantern and walked to the clay embankment. The bank faced south-southeast, not square to the north wind, which meant wind would pass along it rather than driving straight into an opening. The clay was dense, reddish at the surface, blue-gray beneath where water had not weathered it. She pressed her thumb into it, and it held the mark without crumbling. That meant cohesion. That meant it might hold a ceiling. Might, not would. She did not know enough to be certain, but she knew this. Lumber cost $60. Clay cost labor. She had no money. She had 2 shovels. She scratched a rectangle into the bank face with the corner of the broken mattock, 12 feet wide. She paced it, 18 feet deep. She would not know if that was possible until she was inside. 7 feet high at the front where she could stand, sloping to 6 feet at the rear where the shelf would be. A slight downward slope toward the entrance so water would drain out rather than pooling. The stove would go near the front, where the pipe could exit through the upper face of the bank without fighting a long horizontal run. A sleeping shelf carved from the rear wall, a clay bench along one side, and an entry hood, branches, woven willow, clay daub, sod, low enough that wind would pass over it rather than driving in. She did not know the word for what she was counting on. She would never know it. The word was thermal mass, and it described the principle that dense materials absorbed heat slowly, stored it, and released it slowly. Earth 4 feet below the surface maintained a temperature far warmer than blizzard air. Not warm, not comfortable, but survivable when the alternative was a shack that the wind would flatten. What Eliza knew was simpler and older. The deeper wall will not give up heat as fast as boards. Her father had shown her this. The potatoes had proven it. The clay against her palm was proving it now. She went back inside. Ruth was still asleep against the wall. Eliza sat down beside her and began planning. She had 43 days before winter arrived in earnest. She needed to excavate roughly 150 cubic feet of clay and rock per day to finish in time. She did not know if that was possible. She did not know if the ceiling would hold. She did not know if the drainage would work, or the smoke would vent, or the entrance would survive the first real snow. She knew that Vale's verdict was correct. She could not build a cabin. She did not have the money, the lumber, the labor, or the time. But Vale had asked the wrong question. He had asked how to raise walls. Eliza was not going to raise walls. She was going to subtract space from the earth. The earth was already there. It had been there for 10,000 years. It was not going anywhere. The risk was real, and she did not pretend otherwise. A misjudged ceiling span could collapse and bury them. Seepage could flood the floor and freeze them out. Smoke could accumulate and suffocate them in their sleep. A heavy snow could seal the entrance and trap them underground. Every one of those risks was serious. Every one of them had killed people. But freezing in a roofless shed was not a risk. It was a certainty. Eliza chose the uncertain death over the certain one. She picked up the shovel at first light. She tested before she committed. On the morning of October 29th, Eliza dug a pilot hole into the clay bank. 2 feet deep, 2 feet wide, 2 feet high. She set a tin cup of water inside it and another tin cup outside on the ground. She weighted both with pebbles so the wind would not tip them. Then she went back to the shed and waited. By morning, the outside cup had skinned over with a rime of ice. Not solid, but crusted. The temperature had dropped below freezing overnight, and the water had begun to turn. The cup inside the pilot hole had not. The water was cold, cold enough to ache the fingers, but it was liquid, no ice, no rime, no crust. Eliza held both cups in front of Ruth. She did not explain. Ruth looked at them. She looked at the pilot hole. She looked at the clay bank. "How deep do we need to go?" Ruth asked. 18 feet. Ruth set the iced cup down and picked up the other shovel. Mercy Cole arrived on the afternoon of October 30th with a jar of beans and a look on her face that was halfway between sympathy and alarm. She was 34, mother of 4, wife of Orrin Cole, whose farm sat 2 miles northwest. She was practical in the way that women on the plains had to be practical. She could dress a wound, deliver a calf, and calculate whether a barrel of flour would last until April while nursing an infant on her hip. She was not unkind, but kindness on the frontier had limits, and those limits were drawn by what made sense. What Eliza was doing did not make sense. Mercy stood at the mouth of the pilot hole, now widened to 4 feet across and 3 feet deep, and watched Eliza swing the mattock into the clay face. Each stroke produced a dull, heavy sound. The clay came away in slabs the size of bread loaves. Ruth carried them out in a bucket and dumped them on a growing pile to the east. "Eliza," Mercy said, "what are you doing?" "Digging." "I can see that. What I am asking is why." Eliza paused. She leaned on the mattock handle and pushed her hair out of her face with the back of her wrist. Her hands were already raw. The baling wire wrapped around the mattock head had shifted and was cutting through the branch handle. She had 2 days of digging left before it would snap entirely. "A dugout," Eliza said. 12 by 18, deep enough to hold heat, low enough that the wind passes over. Mercy set the bean jar on a flat rock and crossed her arms. "Eliza, I have seen dugouts. The Petersons had one the first year they came. Water came through the walls every time it rained. Mud fell from the ceiling into their food. Their youngest got the croup and nearly died before they built a proper cabin. The Petersons dug on flat ground with sandy soil and no drainage," Eliza said. "I am cutting into a clay bank with a natural slope." "You are a woman with 2 shovels and a girl." "I am aware." Mercy uncrossed her arms and then crossed them again. She looked at Ruth, who was dragging the bucket up the slope without pausing. "Damp walls will sicken her. The roof will cave. No decent family can live like badgers, Eliza." Eliza met her eyes. "Decent families do not live at all when they freeze in a canvas shack. I am not choosing between good and bad. I am choosing between bad and dead." Mercy had no answer for that. She left the beans and walked back to her wagon without saying goodbye. She was not angry. She was frightened. And frightened people leave before the thing they fear becomes their responsibility. That night, Eliza and Ruth ate the beans cold because the stovepipe was clogged with creosote and Eliza did not have the wire brush to clean it. Ruth scraped the bottom of the jar with a spoon and said, "She thinks we're going to die." "She's not sure of that," Eliza said. "That is why she brought the beans." The first days of digging established the rhythm that would govern the next 6 weeks. They woke before dawn. They ate whatever could be eaten cold, usually cornmeal mixed with water, sometimes a piece of dried pork if Eliza had managed to trade labor for provisions. Then they dug. The clay was dense, but workable in the first 3 feet. Eliza swung the mattock to break the face. Ruth shoveled the loose material into the bucket. When the bucket was full, Ruth hauled it out and dumped it. Eliza counted strokes. 40 strokes of the mattock produced roughly 1 bucket of material. 8 buckets cleared approximately 1 foot of depth across the full width. That meant 320 mattock strokes per foot of progress. At 18 feet deep, that was 5,760 strokes, not counting the ceiling shaping, the side trenching, the bench carving, or the sleeping shelf. Eliza did not share this calculation with Ruth. Some numbers were better left uncounted. Day 1, 3 feet into the bank. The clay held. No collapses. But the work was brutal. By noon, Eliza's shoulders burned, and her grip on the mattock was slippery with sweat despite the cold. Ruth's palms had blistered before lunch. She wrapped them in strips torn from the hem of an underskirt and kept shoveling. Day 4, 6 feet wide, 4 feet deep. They had cleared enough to stand inside the opening and feel the temperature difference. The back of the cut was noticeably less cold than the air outside. Not warm, not even close to warm, but muted, as if someone had taken the sharp edge off the wind and left only the dull ache beneath. Ruth pressed her hand against the back wall and held it there. She said, "It does not bite." "No," Eliza said. "It does not." Day 7, the first ceiling crumble. They had cut the ceiling flat because flat was easier to dig, and Eliza did not yet know better. A slab of clay the size of a saddle blanket let go from the roof and dropped onto Ruth's boots. It did not injure her. It did not even hurt, but it covered her feet in wet clay and sent a crack racing along the ceiling from the drop point to the entrance. Ruth jumped back. Eliza looked up at the crack. It was thin, a hairline, not a gap, but it ran the full length of what they had excavated, and it whispered of something worse waiting above. They stopped digging. They stood outside in the cold and looked at the face of the bank and said nothing for a long time. Then Eliza said, "The ceiling cannot be flat." "What should it be?" "I do not know yet." That was the truth, and it was terrifying. She had committed to a method she did not fully understand. She had trusted the principle, earth holds heat, earth blocks wind, but the engineering was beyond what her father had shown her. A root cellar in Pennsylvania was 5 feet deep with stone walls and a timber roof. What she was attempting was 18 feet deep with nothing above but the clay itself, and the clay had just told her it would not hold as a flat span. She needed someone who understood how earth behaved under load, someone who had cut into a bank before and lived to explain why the ceiling stood or fell. She did not know where to find that person, but the crack in the ceiling was not going to wait while she searched. Ruth sat on the clay pile and unwrapped her blistered palms. The cloth was stained brown and pink. She looked at her hands and then at the dugout entrance and then at her mother. "We need help," Ruth said. Eliza did not answer immediately. She was looking south, past the creek bed, past the low ridgeline toward the road that led to Broken Bow. Help was not coming from that direction. The men who might have helped had already decided what Eliza Marden was, a stubborn widow digging her own grave. But the help she needed was not the kind men built with. It was the kind that came from someone who had already listened to clay and learned what it said. She just had to find that person before the ceiling found them first. The mockery started on the 3rd day, but it did not become public until the morning of November 2nd, when Ruth walked into Broken Bow to buy lamp wicks, salt, and a single box of nails. Baird's mercantile and bank room sat on the main street with a painted false front that made it look larger than it was. Inside, the bank counter was separated from the dry goods by a polished oak rail that Rufus Baird kept waxed because he believed the barrier between money and merchandise should look like it meant something. Baird was 47, clean-shaven, soft-handed, and he spoke in a voice that made civic concern sound like personal generosity. He had held Thomas Marden's note. He held several others. When a family failed, their land did not disappear. It waited, and Baird was patient. Ruth set her purchases on the counter: lamp wicks, salt, 1 box of 20-penny nails, the smallest box available, because even that cost more than she wanted to spend. The clerk tallied it. A man at the stove, Ned Kroll, the freight hauler, looked at the nails and then at Ruth. What are you building, girl? A door. A door for what? Ruth did not answer. She paid and left. But Kroll had seen her earlier that morning carrying willow branches along the road, and he had asked around. By afternoon, the story had spread. The Marden widow was digging a hole in a clay bank and calling it a house. Kroll was the first to say it. Mole women, he said, leaning against the counter with a cup of Baird's bad coffee. Digging in the dirt like they lost something down there. The phrase traveled. Men repeated it because it was funny, and because funny things about other people's misfortune are the cheapest entertainment on the frontier. Within a week, riders detoured past the clay bank to watch. They sat on their horses and observed Ruth emerge from the widening hole with clay smeared across her face and hands, and they laughed. One man, Eliza never learned his name, called down from the road, "You digging a grave or a parlor?" Ruth picked up a clod of clay and pulled her arm back to throw it. Eliza caught her wrist. "Count shovelfuls," Eliza said. "I want to—" "Count shovelfuls. He's not worth a clod." Ruth put the clay down. She counted. 37 more that afternoon. Rufus Baird did not ride past to laugh. Baird arrived in a buggy on November 4th, wearing a coat that had never been anywhere near manual labor, and he brought an offer. He stood at the edge of the excavation and looked at it the way a man looks at a stain on a tablecloth, something unpleasant that should be removed before guests arrive. "Mrs. Marden," he said, "I've come with a proposition." Eliza kept digging. She did not stop for Baird. She had learned that stopping for men who held power was the same as giving them permission to use it. $25 for this parcel, cash. Enough for train fare east if you and the girl travel light. Your sister's in Iowa, I believe. Eliza drove the mattock into the clay and twisted. A slab came free. She kicked it toward the bucket. "My sister's house has 2 rooms and 5 children. Better 2 rooms and 5 children than no rooms and a hole in a bank. This hole in a bank will have walls that do not leak wind and a ceiling that does not lift in a gale. When it is finished." Baird adjusted his cuffs. "Mrs. Marden, I say this with genuine concern. Winter will make this decision for you. A widow and a young girl cannot dig a shelter sufficient to survive January. Every sensible person in this valley agrees with me." "Then I will add sensible to the list of things I cannot afford." Baird's expression did not change. He had the face of a man who expected refusal and had already planned for it. He took a folded paper from his coat, placed it on a rock, weighted it with a stone, and said, "That offer stands until the first frost. After that, the price drops." He climbed back into the buggy and drove away. Ruth watched him go. Then she picked up the paper, unfolded it, and read it. $25, she said. "That would get us to Iowa." "And then what?" "I do not know. Neither do I. But I know what happens if we stay, and I know what happens if we go. If we stay, the outcome depends on what I build. If we go, the outcome depends on what other people allow. I would rather depend on clay." Ruth folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. She did not throw it away. Eliza noticed that. Mercy Cole came again the following week. This time she did not bring beans. She brought her opinion. She stood at the entrance while Eliza and Ruth ate a cold supper of cornmeal and pork fat inside the excavation, which was now 8 feet deep and beginning to feel like a room. A rough, dark, dripping room with a ceiling that still frightened Eliza every time she looked up. "Eliza, take the money." "No. $25 is not nothing." $25 is the price he puts on making us disappear. This parcel has the creek access. He wants to consolidate grazing land. Thomas knew that. It is why he bought it. Mercy's face softened. She looked at Ruth. Ruth was scraping the last cornmeal from the pot with her fingers. "Ruth," Mercy said, "tell your mother." Ruth looked up. Her face was filthy. Her hands were wrapped in cloth that needed washing. She was 15 years old, and she looked like she had been mining coal. "Tell her what, Mrs. Cole?" "That this is not living." Ruth put the pot down. She looked at Mercy with an expression that Eliza recognized as Thomas's. That level, measuring gaze that weighed a person without malice and without mercy. "Living is what you do when you are not dead," Ruth said. "We are not dead." Mercy left. She was crying, but she turned her face so they would not see. That night, lying on the dirt floor of the excavation with the stovepipe leaking a thin thread of smoke, Ruth said, "Is pride going to kill us?" Eliza was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Pride is refusing to see what is true. I'm trying to see it before the weather does." The excavation was 8 feet deep. The ceiling crack had not widened. The clay was holding. But Eliza did not know how to make it hold for another 10 feet, and she did not know who would teach her, and winter was 5 weeks away. Ruth's question hung in the smoke-stained air of that unfinished hole. Was this determination, or was it something worse? If you have ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building, tell us in the comments. Because what happened next began with a stranger's wagon stopping on the road. The ceiling needed an arch. Eliza knew this the way she knew the stove collar needed replacing. The evidence was visible in the crack above her head, in the slab that had dropped on Ruth's boots, in every flat span of unsupported clay that gravity was quietly testing. A flat ceiling was a table. A table held weight only at its edges. The middle was a promise waiting to break. But she did not know how to cut an arch into clay. She did not know how wide the rib should be. She did not know whether the blue-gray bands were stronger or weaker than the red. She did not know if branchwood could reinforce a span or if it would rot and bring the ceiling down with it. On November 8th, Ruth was dragging a bundle of willow branches along the road toward the parcel, branches cut from the creek bed scrub for the entry hood, when a wagon stopped behind her. The driver was a woman, 58 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they had been shaped by the same forces that shaped the land. Her face was weathered past the point where age was readable. She could have been 50. She could have been 70. Her name was Barbara Flatten, and she lived 7 miles north in a sod house with a root cellar built into a bank that had not leaked in 4 years. Barbara did not ask Ruth what she was doing. She watched Ruth drag the branches for about 30 feet. Then she said, in an accent that turned every vowel slightly sideways, "You are pulling those wrong. The butt ends should face forward. Otherwise, you catch every stone." Ruth stopped. She turned around. She looked at the woman on the wagon, and then at the branches, and then back at the woman. "How do you know about branches?" Ruth asked. "I know about everything you drag across the ground. I've dragged most things. Get on the wagon. Show me where you're going." Ruth climbed up. She pointed south. When Barbara saw the excavation, she did not speak for a full minute. She climbed down from the wagon and walked to the entrance and looked inside. She put her hand on the ceiling and pressed. She crumbled a piece of the wall in her fingers. She smelled it. She ran her thumb along the crack line and followed it to where it ended near the entrance. Eliza came around the corner of the shed with the mattock and found a strange woman standing inside her dugout with clay under her fingernails. "Who are you?" Eliza said. "Barbara Flatten. Your daughter has no calluses in the right places. Your ceiling is going to kill you, and your clay is better than you deserve." Eliza gripped the mattock. "My ceiling is cracked because you cut it flat. Earth does not want to be flat. Earth wants to curve." You are fighting it instead of letting it do what it already knows. Barbro turned to face her. She had pale eyes that did not blink often enough for comfort. You are not guessing, she said. I can see that. You tested first. You chose this bank for a reason. You angled the entrance away from the north. But you are listening badly. I can teach you to listen better. This was not charity. Barbro had watched Eliza's excavation from the road 2 days earlier and had seen enough to know that the woman inside was working from principle, not desperation alone. The angle of the cut, the slope of the floor, the position of the stove. These were decisions, not accidents. Bad decisions in some cases, but decisions made by a mind that was reasoning, and Barbro respected reasoning the way Vale respected measurement. That afternoon, Barbro taught the first lesson. She cut a fistful of clay from the bank at 3 different heights. She rolled each piece between her palms, smelled it, broke it in half, and examined the fracture. The red is weathered, she said. It holds shape when dry, but cracks when wet. The blue-gray is deeper clay. It sweats. It weeps moisture in damp weather, but it holds weight. It will not crumble under pressure the way the red does. She pointed to a band of blue-gray that ran 2 feet below the ceiling line. This is your roof clay. Cut above it, not through it. The blue-gray is your friend. The red is decoration. Eliza looked at the ceiling crack. It ran through red clay. I cut through the wrong layer. You did. You also cut too wide too fast. Slow the face. Narrow it. Let the arch tell you where it wants to be. Ruth watched from the entrance. She was holding a willow branch, and she was paying attention the way she paid attention to everything, silently, completely, without appearing to miss a single word. Barbro stayed until dark. She showed Eliza how to use a willow wand and a length of twine to scribe a shallow curve along the ceiling, not a sharp arch, but a gentle rise that distributed the clay's weight outward to the walls, instead of concentrating it at a flat center. She showed Ruth how to shave the ceiling with the flat of a shovel blade, taking thin passes, never gouging, following the curve of the twine guide. Leave ribs, Barbro said, pointing to ridges of clay she had left uncut between the shaved sections. Temporary. They hold the weight while you work. When the branch lattice goes up, the ribs come out, not before. When she left, Eliza walked her to the wagon. Why did you stop? Eliza asked. Barbro climbed onto the seat and gathered the reins. Because you chose the right bank. Most people choose the wrong one. I wanted to see if the rest of your thinking was as good. Is it? Parts. The ceiling was going to kill you inside a month. The drainage is missing. The air vent does not exist yet. But the angle is correct and the floor slope is correct, and you tested with a water cup before you started cutting, which means you are not praying, you are thinking. I do not help people who pray. I help people who think. She drove away into the dark. Ruth stood at the entrance with the lantern. She looked at her mother. She smelled the clay, Ruth said. She did. Is that a real thing? Can you learn something by smelling clay? Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think you can learn a great deal by smelling clay. I think we're going to find out. The ceiling crack still ran above them in the lantern light, but now Eliza knew why it was there, and she knew how to stop it from spreading, and she knew that somewhere 7 miles north lived a woman who had already made every mistake Eliza was about to make and had survived them all. The frost was coming. The calendar was not negotiable. But for the first time since the deputy had stood in her kitchen and refused to meet Ruth's eyes, Eliza went to sleep believing the arithmetic might work. The ceiling still needed to be recut. The drainage trenches had not been started. The air vent did not exist. The entry hood was a pile of willow branches and a plan. The stove collar was still cracked. They had $7.40 left, and November was 10 days old, and the wind outside the clay bank was beginning to carry the sound that the old settlers called the first voice of winter, a low, sustained moan that did not rise or fall, but simply continued, hour after hour, like something very large and very patient, reminding them that it had not yet begun. Barbara returned 2 days later with a wagon load that included spruce pitch in a tin, a bundle of stripped willow rods, a hand saw with a cracked handle that still cut true, and a piece of advice that Eliza would remember for the rest of her life. Do not trust what holds today. Trust what will hold when it is wet. They began the recut that morning. Barbro stood inside the excavation and pointed at the ceiling with a willow rod, tracing the line where the shallow arch should go. She did not draw it on paper. She did not measure with a square. She used the wand the way a dowser uses a stick. She held it against the clay and moved it until something in her expression said, yes. Here, she said. You feel the curve? I feel clay, Eliza said. Clay has a curve it wants to follow. Press your palm flat against it and drag slowly. Where your hand rises, that is where the arch peaks. Where your hand falls, that is where the rib stays. The clay already knows. You just have to stop arguing with it. Ruth learned faster than Eliza. Her hands were smaller, and she could feel the subtle contours in the ceiling that Eliza's calloused palms missed. Within an hour, Ruth was shaving the ceiling with the flat of the shovel blade, thin passes following the twine guide, following the curve that Barbro had traced. Clay curls fell like damp ribbons. The crack stopped spreading. The shaved sections held. Barbro watched and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "The girl has the hands for this." Eliza felt something she did not expect. Not jealousy, relief. If Ruth could feel the ceiling, then Ruth could maintain it after Eliza was too tired or too hurt to climb the ladder. The skill was spreading. The knowledge was not trapped inside one pair of hands. That was November 10th. The temperature that morning was 28 degrees at dawn. Barbro said it would be colder next week. She was right. The construction moved in stages, and each stage revealed a new problem that had been invisible from the outside. Stage 1 was the main chamber. Walls squared where they met the bank face, ceiling arched and ribbed, floor sloped slightly toward the entrance. Barbro taught them to leave the temporary clay ribs in place, ridges of uncut material between the shaved sections, until the branch lattice was ready to take the ceiling's weight. Removing the ribs too early was how people died. Barbro said this plainly, without drama, the way she said everything. Take a rib out before the lattice is set, and the ceiling drops before you hear it crack. Stage 2 was drainage. Barbro was immovable on this point. She made Eliza cut a trench 6 inches wide and 4 inches deep along both side walls. Running from the back of the chamber to a gravel pocket, she had Ruth dig outside the entrance. The trenches would carry any seepage, rain, snowmelt, condensation, away from the living space and out of the dugout. Water is patient, Barbro said. It will wait for you to forget it, and then it will take the floor. Eliza argued that the trenches cost 2 days of work they did not have. Barbro pointed at the blue-gray clay band and said, "This clay sweats. In January, water will seep through it and pool on your floor. You will wake up in a puddle. A puddle freezes. Frozen floor steals heat from your body faster than wind. Dig the trenches." Eliza dug the trenches. Stage 3 was ventilation. This was the argument that became the first real friction between them. Barbro wanted 2 openings. The main entrance and a fist-wide vent cut through the upper front face of the bank, lined with a stovepipe scrap, angled upward so that warm air rising inside the dugout would pull smoke and stale air out through the vent while fresh air crept in through the entrance. Warmth kills if it cannot breathe, Barbro said. Eliza understood the principle. She had seen it in the shed, smoke pooling, carbon building, Ruth vomiting, but she feared the vent would become a cold channel, a highway for winter air to pour through. Fist wide, Barbro said. No wider. Line it with the stovepipe scrap. Angle it up, not straight. Cold air is heavy. It falls. Warm air is light. It rises. The vent serves the warm air. The cold air stays on the floor near the trench. You do not fight physics, Eliza. You make physics work for you. They cut the vent on November 14th. Barbro supervised while Ruth held the stovepipe section, and Eliza packed clay around it. When it was done, Barbro lit a twist of hay inside the chamber and held it near the vent. The smoke pulled upward and out. Not all of it. Enough. Good, Barbro said. Not perfect. Good. The front wall was the fourth stage and the most labor-intensive. The main chamber was carved directly into the bank, but the entrance needed a constructed face. Something to hold a door, frame the stovepipe exit, and create the low hood that would deflect wind. Eliza scavenged cottonwood posts from the wreckage of an old fence line half a mile south. She and Ruth carried them on their shoulders 4 trips over 2 days. The posts were crooked and weathered, but solid enough to bear weight. They set 3 posts vertically across the front of the excavation, sank them 18 inches into the floor, and braced them with wedge stones. Between the posts, they wove willow branches horizontally, a technique Barbro showed them using the rod she had brought. The willow created a lattice that held shape when wet and flexed without breaking. Over the willow lattice, they packed clay daub mixed with grass and straw. Over the daub, they stacked sod bricks cut from the prairie above the bank, grass side down, overlapping like shingles. The entry hood was the final exterior element. 2 forked branches set at an angle over the doorway, willow matting stretched between them, clay and sod packed on top. The hood was low, 5 feet at its peak, which meant everyone had to duck to enter. This was intentional. A low hood meant wind passed over it instead of driving in through the opening. Ruth complained about the height. She was 5'6", and the duck was severe. Barbro said, "You will stop noticing in a week. The wind will never stop noticing." The setbacks accumulated the way cold accumulates, slowly at first, then all at once. November 15th. A rain turned the floor to paste. The drainage trenches were not yet connected to the gravel pocket outside, so water pooled at the entrance and began seeping backward into the chamber. Eliza and Ruth spent 4 hours in the dark, by lantern light, digging through mud to connect the trenches. By the time the water began draining, their boots were soaked through, and Ruth's teeth were chattering so hard she bit her tongue. November 17th. The stovepipe would not draw. The collar was still cracked, the same crack that had smoked them out of the shed, and the new configuration inside the dugout created a different draft pattern. Smoke pooled near the ceiling even with the vent open. Eliza adjusted the vent angle twice before realizing the problem was not the vent, but the stove itself. The cracked collar allowed cold air to leak in at the base of the pipe, disrupting the updraft. She sealed the crack with a paste of clay and ash, packed tight, and wrapped a strip of tin, cut from a bean can, around the joint. The repair held, but she knew it was temporary. The clay would crack again with the heat cycling. She needed proper stove cement or a new collar, and she had neither. November 19th. A lantern smoke stain on the ceiling revealed that air was pooling in a pocket near the rear of the chamber. The arch was correct, but a dip in the ceiling line, a place where Eliza had cut too deep before Barbro's arrival, created a hollow where stale air collected. Ruth saw the stain first, a dark oval on the clay, directly above the sleeping shelf. "That is where we put our heads," Ruth said. Eliza looked at it. If they slept beneath that pocket, they would breathe pooled carbon all night. She could not raise the ceiling without weakening the arch. She could not lower the sleeping shelf without losing the insulation benefit of being elevated above the cold floor. Barbro solved it on her next visit by cutting a shallow groove from the pocket to the vent line, a channel in the ceiling clay no wider than 2 fingers. The groove gave the trapped air a path to follow toward the vent. It was an elegant solution, and it cost 15 minutes of careful scraping. Eliza would have spent a day trying to solve it with geometry. Barbro solved it by understanding that air, like water, follows the path you give it. November 21st, the mattock handle finally broke. The baling wire had been cutting into the cottonwood branch for 3 weeks, and the branch gave way mid-swing. The mattock head flew off and struck the side wall, chipping a piece of clay the size of a fist from the drainage trench. Eliza stood holding a splintered stick and stared at the wall. She could not buy a new handle. A proper hickory mattock handle cost 60 cents, and 60 cents was food for 4 days. Ruth found a solution. She walked to the rail depot ash pile outside Broken Bow, where the railroad burned scrap lumber and broken crates, and scavenged 3 boards of oak from a demolished shipping crate. The boards were charred on one end but sound on the other. Eliza shaped one into a handle with the handsaw and wedged it into the mattock head with a combination of clay, wood shims, and the remaining baling wire. It was ugly. It worked. November 22nd. A badger had dug a tunnel that intersected the upper rear of the chamber. Water from the surface found the tunnel and leaked through, creating a slow drip onto the sleeping shelf. Eliza packed the tunnel with clay and stones, but the repair would need checking after every rain and every snow melt. The earth was full of passages she could not see, and any one of them could become a channel for the water she was trying to keep out. Hiram Vale returned on November 23rd. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared at the entrance, square in his coat pocket, and looked inside. Eliza and Ruth were fitting the branch lattice against the ceiling. The lattice was a web of willow rods and cottonwood sticks, lashed together with strips of rawhide Barbro had given them, pressed against the arch ceiling and wedged in place with clay plugs. When complete, the lattice would hold the ceiling's weight, even if a section of clay cracked or shifted. It was the skeleton that made the arch survivable. Vale watched for a full minute. Then he reached up and pressed his hand flat against the arch at its peak. He dragged his palm along the curve, the same gesture Barbro had taught Eliza, though he did not know that. "Less foolish than it was," he said. Eliza kept working. High praise from a man who called it a delay. I called it a delay because that is what it was. Delays become shelters when they acquire roofs that stay up. This, he tapped the lattice with his knuckle, is approaching a roof. The lattice distributes load across the full width. The arch pushes weight outward to the walls. The ribs stay until the lattice is set. Then I cut them free. Vale considered this. He pressed the lattice at 3 points. He examined the junction where the willow rods crossed and were lashed. He looked at the drainage trenches and the vent. "Who taught you this?" he asked. "Barbro Flatten." "The Norwegian woman north of the creek." "Yes." Vale made a sound that was not quite approval and not quite dismissal. He said, "She knows turf. I do not know if she knows span. Frost heave will test this in January. The clay will expand when it freezes and contract when it thaws. If the lattice is rigid, it will crack. If it is too loose, the ceiling will sag." The rawhide lashing gives, Eliza said. Barbaro designed it that way. Tight enough to hold, loose enough to flex. Vale looked at the lashing. He pulled one joint and watched it give a quarter-inch and spring back. Adequate, he said. Then he left. Ruth watched him go from inside the dugout. She wiped clay from her forehead and said, "Why do men believe a thing only after another man almost says it first?" Eliza did not answer. She was counting the remaining ribs that needed to be cut free, calculating how many days until the lattice was fully set, measuring in her mind the narrowing distance between their progress and the first true cold. The progress could be tracked like a ledger, and Eliza tracked it because numbers did not lie and numbers did not comfort falsely. They simply were. October 29th, chamber marked. The rectangle scratched into the clay face. November 5th, 8 feet excavated, the floor slope established. The first drainage trench started. November 12th, both side trenches cut, connected to the gravel pocket. Water now flowed out instead of pooling. November 17th, stove alcove shaped near the front. The stove would sit on a flat stone platform, elevated 4 inches above the floor to protect the clay from cracking under heat. November 21st, branch lattice complete across the full ceiling span. The temporary clay ribs still held, waiting to be cut free one at a time as the lattice took the load. November 26th, front wall daubed. The cottonwood posts were set, the willow lattice woven, the clay packed, the sod stacked. The entry hood was in place. From the outside, the dugout looked like nothing, a low, dark mouth in a clay bank, barely 5 feet high at the peak, with a stovepipe poking out at an angle. It looked like something an animal would build. It looked like failure. From the inside, it looked like a room. Not a comfortable room, not a warm room, not a room anyone would choose if they had $60 and a crew of carpenters, but a room with walls that did not flex in the wind, a ceiling that held its own weight, a floor that drained, and an air supply that moved smoke out instead of letting it settle on the lungs of a sleeping girl. December 1st, first night sleeping inside. Eliza laid the bedding on the sleeping shelf, raised 18 inches above the floor on a clay platform covered with straw, then a canvas, then the quilts. Ruth lay down and pulled the quilt to her chin. The stove was lit. The clay walls absorbed the heat slowly, grudgingly, the way Eliza had learned they absorbed everything, not fast, not generous, but steady. The temperature inside the dugout at sunset was 34 degrees. By midnight, with the stove banked and the entrance canvas drawn, it was 39. Outside, the wind crossed the prairie at 20 miles an hour. The temperature at the road was 19. Ruth slept the whole night for the first time in 5 weeks. A moment of unexpected help arrived the next morning. 2 sacks of straw appeared at the entrance. No note, no name. Fresh-cut straw, bound with twine, stacked against the entry hood wall. Mercy Cole's oldest boy, Darren, was seen walking back toward the Cole farm by a neighbor who told Eliza 3 days later. When Eliza mentioned it to Mercy at the store, Mercy denied sending him. "Darren makes his own decisions," Mercy said. "I do not control where a boy puts his feet." But her voice was not steady when she said it, and she looked at Eliza for one moment longer than a lie required. By the second week of December, the dugout was complete enough to live in and rough enough to prove that living was not the same as thriving. The ceiling held. The drainage worked. The vent pulled smoke. The entry hood deflected wind. These were victories, and Eliza allowed herself to count them because counting victories was how you survived long enough to face the next defeat. But the dugout was also ugly, low, smoky, and damp at the edges. Condensation formed on the ceiling overnight and dripped onto whatever was beneath it, usually bedding, Occasionally the stove, once directly into the Dutch oven where Eliza was cooking beans. The clay walls wept in the afternoon when sun warmed the bank above and moisture migrated downward. The floor, despite the drainage trenches, was perpetually cold and slightly tacky underfoot. Eliza began recording temperatures with a wall thermometer Barbro had lent her, a mercury tube in a wooden case that Barbro's husband had brought from Norway and that Barbro treated with more reverence than she treated most people. The numbers told the story. Outside at dawn, 6 degrees. Inside, 38 before the stove was lit. Outside at noon, 22 degrees. Inside, 42 with coals banked low. Outside at dusk, 12 degrees. Inside, 40 with the stove fed. These were not comfortable temperatures. 40 degrees is cold enough to see your breath, cold enough to stiffen fingers, cold enough to make sleep difficult without heavy blankets. But 40 degrees is not killing cold. 40 degrees is the temperature at which water does not freeze, food does not spoil overnight, and a sick child does not die of exposure between midnight and dawn. The difference between 6 degrees outside and 38 degrees inside was the earth itself. 4 feet of clay on the ceiling, 6 feet of clay on the sides, 18 feet of clay at the rear. Every cubic foot of that clay was storing the residual warmth of the previous season and releasing it at a rate so slow that the air inside the chamber could never drop as fast as the air outside. The earth was a bank, and it paid interest in degrees. Ruth learned to bank coals in ash and clay instead of feeding the stove constantly. A bed of coals pressed into a clay-lined pocket on the stove floor held heat for hours. 1 armload of cottonwood and a twist of dried hay would hold the night. In the old claim shed, 1 armload had vanished in 2 hours and left nothing but cold ash and the sound of wind pressing through every gap in every board. The fuel savings alone made the dugout viable. But viable was not safe, and safe was what they needed. Mercy came and looked at the thermometer. She ran her finger along the mercury line and said, "Warmer than death is not the same as safe." "No," Eliza said, "but it is closer to safe than anything I could have built above ground." Vale stopped by and pressed his palm against the ceiling in 3 places. He listened. He said, "If a roof beam rots, you will never hear it before it falls. Check the lattice monthly. Cut any section that goes soft." Baird did not visit, but he spoke about them at the store. Ned Kroll relayed it with a grin. Baird says the women are training themselves for burial. Says the first heavy snow will seal them in and the spring thaw will find them pickled. Ruth heard this from Darren Cole, who heard it from his father, who heard it from Kroll. She came home with her jaw set and her fists tight. "He wants us to fail," she said. "He wants our land," Eliza said. "Failure is just the method." Barbro returned on December 8th with spruce pitch, rags, and a lesson about the stove collar. She heated the pitch over a small fire outside the entrance, dipped the rags in it, and wrapped the cracked collar in overlapping layers. The pitch sealed against the iron as it cooled, creating a flexible gasket that would expand and contract with the heat, cycling instead of cracking like clay. "Pitch moves," she said. "Clay breaks. Always seal iron with something that moves." While the pitch cured, they argued. Barbro had been pressing Eliza about a second exit, a crawl tunnel through the rear bank, emerging above and behind the dugout, providing an escape route if the entrance was buried by snow or blocked by collapse. "You need a way out that is not the way in," Barbro said. "We do not have time," Eliza said. "The front is finished. The stove is set. The drainage works. If I start cutting a rear tunnel now, I weaken the back wall, and I lose 3 days. 3 days is not 3 lives. The entrance is clear. The hood deflects snow. We can dig out from inside if we must. Barbro set down the pitch tin. She looked at Eliza with those pale eyes that did not blink often enough. Then make time, or the hill owns you. Eliza did not make time. She told herself it was because the entrance worked, because the hood was low, because she could dig out through soft snow faster than she could cut a tunnel through dense clay. All of these things were true, but the deeper truth was that she was exhausted. 6 weeks of digging had stripped 10 pounds from her frame. Her shoulders ached constantly. Her hands were cracked and bleeding at the knuckles despite the tallow she rubbed into them each night. She was making decisions not from the full range of what was wise, but from the narrowed range of what her body could still accomplish. Barbro did not push further. She had said what she came to say. She left the pitch and the rags and drove north into a sky that was beginning to show the kind of light that old settlers recognized. A pale, flat brightness with no depth, as if the sun were being smothered by something it could not burn through. The false warm spells began in late December. A day of 38 degrees, a day of 41. The snow softened on the south-facing slopes. Water ran in the creek bed for the first time since November. Men in town loosened their coats and said the worst had passed. Barbro had warned Eliza about these. On the plains, a warm spell in late December or January was not mercy. It was bait. The warm air came from the south, riding ahead of a pressure system. When the cold front behind it arrived, and it always arrived, the temperature did not merely drop, it crashed. Mild mornings became killing afternoons. The children's blizzard, 2 years earlier, the one that killed hundreds across the plains, had begun on a morning so warm that children walked to school without coats. By afternoon, they could not see their hands in front of their faces. Eliza banked extra fuel inside the dugout. She sealed the entry hood seams with fresh clay. She checked the lattice for any softening. She placed a flat stone beside the lower vent that could be slammed over it in seconds if the draft reversed. Ruth asked why she was preparing when the weather was getting warmer. Eliza said, "The weather is not getting warmer. The weather is getting ready." January 12th, 1888. The morning began warm enough that dripping eaves sent a percussion along the south wall of Baird's store. Warm enough that Ned Kroll drove his freight wagon without gloves. Warm enough that children walked to school in light coats. And Mercy Cole sent her youngest Lottie to the neighbors with a jar of preserves. 4 years old, walking between the farms on a path she had walked 100 times. By noon, the sky to the northwest had changed. Not darkened, exactly. Changed color. The blue leached out of it as if someone were draining a basin, and what replaced it was a green-gray nothing, a color that was the absence of color, a sky that looked like the underside of something massive rolling toward them. The first gust hit at 1:15. It did not build. It arrived fully formed, a wall of air moving at a speed that turned snow into powder, and powder into white smoke, and white smoke into a blindness so total that a person standing in it could not tell the difference between ground and sky. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in less than an hour. The wind did not blow. The wind screamed. It found every loose thing on the plains and tore it free: shingles, shutters, stovepipes, fence rails, a schoolhouse door that had been latched but not barred. The locals would call it the razor wind, because survivors said the air felt like broken glass drawn across exposed skin. Eliza heard it before she felt it. She was inside the dugout, shaving a rough patch on the bench where the clay had dried unevenly. Ruth was on the sleeping shelf, coughing. The cough had started 3 days earlier from an infected blister on her right palm. The blister had split, the raw skin had caught something, and by January 10th the infection had traveled up her wrist. Her palm was swollen and hot to the touch, red streaks climbing toward the elbow. She had a fever of at least 101, though Eliza had no way to measure it precisely. She measured it by Ruth's forehead against her lips, by the speed of Ruth's breathing, by the brightness in her eyes that was not alertness, but heat. The stove draft reversed. That was the first sign. The smoke, which had been pulling steadily toward the vent, suddenly stopped moving and then pushed back into the room. A puff of ash blew out of the stove's air intake. Eliza grabbed the flat stone and slammed it over the lower vent. The smoke stopped pushing inward, but the air in the chamber went immediately stale. Then the sound arrived. Not wind. Something larger than wind. A pressure that came through the earth itself. A vibration she felt in her feet before she heard it in her ears. The entry hood canvas snapped inward once, hard, like a sail catching a gust, and then went rigid as the wind pressed it flat against the frame. Eliza dropped the scraper and moved to the entrance. She pulled the canvas aside and looked out. She could not see the creek bed. She could not see the road. She could not see the claim shed, which was 40 feet away. She could see approximately 3 feet of ground in front of the entry hood, and beyond that, nothing. White. Not snow falling. Snow moving horizontally, driven so hard that it did not fall at all. It flew. She let the canvas drop and secured it with the stone she kept along the base. Ruth! Ruth did not answer. She was lying on the shelf with her infected hand across her chest, eyes closed, breathing through her mouth. Ruth! Stay on the shelf. Do not move. Ruth's eyes opened. They were bright and unfocused. Is it night? No, it is afternoon. It sounds like night. The wind hit the bank above them, and the clay transmitted the vibration downward. A deep, sustained hum, like standing inside a bell that someone was pressing instead of striking. The walls did not move. The ceiling did not move. The lattice held. The arch held. The drainage trenches were dry because the cold was freezing the moisture before it could seep, but the entrance was packing with snow. Eliza watched it happen in real time. Snow was not drifting against the entry hood. It was being driven into it horizontally, packing into the willow, matting like mortar being forced into brick. Within 20 minutes, the lower half of the entrance was solid white. Within 40 minutes, only the upper 18 inches remained open, and the snow was climbing. She grabbed the shovel and began clearing. The snow was dense, wind-packed, heavy, nothing like the fluffy drifts of a calm snowfall. Each shovelful weighed pounds. She cleared a channel through the upper opening, and the wind blew snow back in before she could take a second stroke. She could not keep the entrance clear. Not alone. Not with Ruth feverish on the shelf. Not against wind that was packing snow faster than one woman could move it. Eliza made a decision. She stopped fighting the entrance and let it pack. She left the upper 8 inches open, a gap barely wide enough to admit air, and banked snow against the rest deliberately, packing it tight with the shovel flat, creating a wind-packed wall that was, in its own way, insulation. Snow was not solid. Snow was air trapped in ice crystals. A packed snow wall was a dead air space, and dead air was the best insulator on the frontier. She removed the flat stone from the lower vent. Smoke pushed in for a moment, then stabilized as the reduced entrance opening changed the pressure balance. Air came in through the 8-inch gap. Smoke went out through the upper vent. It was not good. It was not comfortable. The room was hazy and the air tasted like ash, but they could breathe. The stove. She fed it everything she had prepared. Cottonwood splits, twisted hay, 2 crate boards from the rail depot scavenged. The iron heated, the clay walls absorbed. The temperature inside the dugout dropped from 40 to 36 as the storm overwhelmed even the Earth's thermal mass. but 36 degrees inside was the difference between life and death when the temperature outside was falling through zero. Ruth became delirious at some point in the early evening. She asked Eliza if they were underground forever. She asked if the ceiling was falling. She asked for water, and then could not hold the cup. Eliza held it to her lips and caught the spill with a rag. "We are not underground forever," Eliza said. "We are underground until morning." "It sounds like the earth is angry." "The earth is not angry. The earth is the only thing that is not angry. The air is angry. The earth is holding still." Outside, though Eliza would not learn this until later, the coal farm was coming apart. The barn roof, which Orrin Cole had patched but not replaced, caught the wind at the northwest corner where a shake had loosened. The wind got beneath it and peeled it back like skin from a wound. The barn roof tore free in sections, each section catching more wind, until half the roof was gone and the horses inside were screaming. Mercy Cole's kitchen was attached to the main house by a covered passage. The passage roof lifted, not all at once, one end first, then the other, like a lid being pried off. Cold air poured through the gap, and the stovepipe, suddenly exposed to direct wind, reversed. Smoke and ash erupted into the kitchen where Mercy was holding Lottie. The 4-year-old had made it home from the neighbors just minutes before the storm hit, carried the last quarter-mile by her brother Darren, who was 11, and whose fingers were already white when he came through the door. When the passage roof went, Mercy made a decision. She could not stay in a kitchen with a broken roof and a reverse stove. She wrapped Lottie in every blanket she could find, told Darren to hold the girl's face against his chest, and pointed them south, toward the clay bank, toward the mole women. The pounding came at the entrance just after dark. Eliza was sitting beside Ruth, holding a damp cloth against her forehead, listening to the wind do things to the world above that she could only imagine. She heard the sound and thought it was a branch, something loose, something the wind was throwing against the snow-packed entry. Then a voice, muffled, desperate, barely audible over the wind. "Mrs. Marden, for God's sake." If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next knock changes every life in that room. Eliza grabbed the shovel and dug through the packed snow at the entrance. It took her 3 minutes. Her hands were bare. She had lost a glove somewhere in the earlier clearing, and the snow burned her skin. She punched through the last 6 inches and felt the wind hit her face like an open hand. Darren Cole stood in the gap, holding Lottie against his chest. The girl was silent. Darren's face was white with cold and streaked with frozen tears. Behind him, barely visible in the driving snow, 2 larger shapes moved. Eliza grabbed Darren by the coat and pulled him inside. Lottie came with him, limp and quiet. Too quiet. "Her hands," Darren said. Her mittens came off. Eliza unwrapped Lottie's hands. They were white, waxy, stiff, not frozen solid, not yet, but deep enough into frostbite that feeling had been gone for an hour. Eliza pressed Lottie's hands between her own palms and began the slow, painful process of warming them. Lottie screamed. The screaming was good. Screaming meant nerve response. Silence would have meant the tissue was dying. The 2 shapes behind Darren pushed through the entrance. The first was Hiram Vale. His hat was gone. His coat was crusted with ice. His square was still in his pocket. Eliza would notice that later with something between amusement and fury. He had walked a mile in a blizzard that killed horses, and he had not let go of a steel square. The second shape was Rufus Baird. Baird's lips were blue. His gloves were gone. Both hands hung at his sides like dead things. His eyes were open, but they did not seem to be processing what they saw. He stood in the entrance of the dugout he had called a grave and said nothing because he could not speak. Vale half carried him to the clay bench. and sat him down. Vale's own hands were shaking. His voice was hoarse. "His store," Vale said. "The rear roof went. The bank room is open to the sky. Ledgers, flour, everything soaked. I found him walking east on the road. He was going the wrong direction. He would have been dead in 20 minutes. Eliza looked at Baird, the man who had offered her $25 for her land, the man who had told customers she was training herself for burial, the man whose phrase, "A widow needs judgment before she needs courage," had been repeated in every kitchen in the valley. He was sitting on a clay bench in her dugout, unable to close his own fingers. "Crawl, do not stand," Eliza said to Vale. "The warmest air is near the floor. The entry side is coldest. Move him to the rear wall and strip his wet coat." Vale hesitated for a fraction of a second, not from pride, but from the strangeness of taking orders from the woman he had told could not survive. Then he moved. He dragged Baird to the rear wall, peeled the frozen coat off him, and wrapped him in one of Eliza's quilts. Ruth, feverish but awake, looked at Baird from the sleeping shelf above. She said, "Do not lean against the stove. You will burn before you feel it." More came. Ned Kroll arrived an hour later with a dead horse outside. The animal had collapsed 200 yards from the clay bank, and Kroll had walked the rest by following the fence line with his hands. His fingers were white and rigid. 2 on his left hand would never recover. They would blacken over the next week, and the doctor in Broken Bow would remove them in February. Mercy Cole arrived with her 2 middle children. Orrin Cole was somewhere behind her. He had stayed to free the horses from the barn, and Mercy had not waited because Lottie's hands were the only thing that mattered. Orrin arrived 40 minutes later. He had a cut above his eye from a flying shake, and he was limping, but he was alive. Others came, a family named Haas whose summer kitchen had collapsed, an old man named Pell, a cousin of the deputy who had been walking home from town when the storm hit, and who had survived only because his dog led him to the clay bank by scent. 14 people in a room built for 2. The air was foul. The stove smoked. The walls wept condensation that ran down in slow streams and collected in the drainage trenches. Bodies pressed against bodies. Children cried. Kroll moaned when the feeling began returning to his hands. Baird sat against the rear wall and stared at nothing. But the temperature held. 34 degrees. 33. It dropped through the night as 14 bodies drew heat, and the storm poured cold against every surface. But it did not drop below freezing. The earth wall behind Baird's back was 52 degrees. The earth ceiling above them was 48. The thermal mass of the bank absorbed the cold and released its stored warmth into the room at a rate so slow that even 14 people, breathing and sweating and shivering, could not exhaust it faster than it could replenish. The wind passed over them. That was the phrase that would stay in Eliza's mind for the rest of her life. The wind passed over them. It could not get purchase on the buried chamber. It screamed across the top of the bank. It tore at the entry hood. It packed snow against the front wall until the entrance was sealed, and the only light came from the stove, and the only air came through the fist-wide vent that Barbro had insisted on and that Eliza had not wanted to cut. Barbro's vent, Barbro's drainage trenches, Barbro's arched ceiling with its rawhide-lashed lattice that flexed without breaking. Barbro's pale eyes saying, "Do not trust what holds today. Trust what will hold when it is wet." Barbro was 7 miles north, in her own sod house, her own root cellar. Eliza hoped the Norwegian woman had listened to her own advice. The night was long. Sometime before dawn, a settler's wife. Nobody in the room knew her name. She had been walking from somewhere east, was found dead in a roofless summer kitchen half a mile away, one hand on a table leg. Flour scattered across the floor like snow. She had not made it to the clay bank. She had not known it was there. Morning came the way mornings come after storms, not with light, but with the absence of wind. The screaming stopped. The silence that replaced it was so total that Eliza thought for a moment she had gone deaf. Then Lottie coughed, and the sound was so sharp and clear in the still air that it felt like the first sound ever made. Eliza dug out the entrance. The snow wall she had packed was still intact, but the wind-driven drift above it had softened with the calming air. She punched through into daylight so bright it hurt. The prairie was white and featureless. The claim shed was gone, not damaged, gone. Scattered boards, half buried in snow, marked where it had been. The coal barn roof lay in sections across the field. Vale's house, visible as a dark shape to the north, was missing shingles along the entire west face. Baird's false front store, further away, looked intact from the front but open at the back, the rear wall exposed to sky. Ruth came to the entrance, leaning on Eliza's arm. Her fever had not broken, but she was standing. She looked out at the white world, and then back at the 14 people sitting in her mother's dugout, wrapped in quilts, breathing air that smelled like smoke and sweat and clay. "Mole women?" she said. Quietly, not to anyone, just to the morning. The storm had lasted 19 hours. It took 2 days for the roads to become passable, and a week for the valley to understand what it had lost. 3 buildings were roofless. 1 woman was dead. 2 horses were dead. Ned Kroll's left hand would never close properly again. 14 people had survived the night inside a hole in a clay bank that the community had called a grave. The arithmetic was simple enough for anyone to read. Hiram Vale stood outside the dugout entrance on the morning of January 14th, bareheaded in the snow, with his square still in his coat pocket and his hat somewhere between his house and the Marden parcel where the wind had taken it. His house was open to the sky along the west face. 3 rafters had lifted. The tar paper had peeled back in a strip 12 feet long. Snow lay on his bedroom floor in a drift shaped like a sleeping animal. He had built that house himself. Peeled the logs, squared the sills, cut the joints, hung the door plumb. He had measured everything twice and cut once, the way his army training had taught him, and the wind had not cared about any of it. 12 people stood around him in the snow, the survivors who had sheltered in the dugout, plus a few neighbors who had come to see the damage and stayed to see the clay bank. Vale did not look at them. He looked at the entrance, at the low hood with its willow matting and sod cap, at the entry that was ugly and crude and intact. He said, "I called it a delay." Nobody spoke. "I was wrong. It was a house when mine was kindling." He said this without drama, without warmth, without the inflection of a man making a speech. He said it the way he said everything, as a measurement. He had measured the dugout against his cabin, and the dugout had held, and the cabin had not, and Hiram Vale did not argue with measurements. Eliza was standing near the entrance with a shovel in her hand. She had been clearing the drift from the front wall. She did not respond to Vale's statement. She did not need to. The clay behind her had already responded, but Vale was not finished. He turned to the group and said, "I told this woman she could not survive here. I told her she needed lumber, nails, tar paper, and 2 men. She had none of those things. She had clay and a Norwegian woman who knew how to listen to it. And last night, when the wind took my roof and opened Baird's store and killed a horse under Ned Kroll, this woman's hole in the ground held 14 people above freezing until morning." He paused. He pulled the square from his pocket and looked at it as if seeing it for the first time. "I have been building with straight lines for 40 years. I never once asked what the ground already knew." This was the first validation. It landed with the weight of a man who had never admitted error in the memory of anyone present. The community came to Eliza not as pilgrims, but as people with broken houses and approaching weather. They came because they needed something that worked, and the evidence was standing in front of them with a low door and a stovepipe at an angle. Orrin Cole came first, the afternoon after the storm. His barn roof was scattered across his south field. His kitchen passage was open. His family had survived in the dugout, and his youngest daughter's fingers were still bandaged where the frostbite had taken skin. "Show me," he said. Eliza showed him. She walked him through the dugout, the arch, the drainage trenches, the vent, the sleeping shelf, the stove placement, the entry hood. She explained each element not as a lecture, but as a sequence of problems solved. The ceiling cracked because it was flat. The arch distributed weight. The floor flooded because there was no drainage. The trenches carried water out. The air went bad because there was no vent. The fist-wide opening pulled smoke and carbon upward. Cole listened the way farmers listen, silently, with his hands in his pockets, nodding at the parts that made sense and frowning at the parts that did not. "The clay," he said. "How do you know which clay holds?" Eliza broke a piece from the wall and handed it to him. "Roll it in your palm. If it holds together and does not crumble, it has enough cohesion to bear a ceiling. If it crumbles, it is too sandy. If it sticks to your hand and will not release, it has too much moisture and will swell when it freezes." "What about the blue-gray bands?" "Stronger than the red. The red is weathered. It cracks in cycles. The blue-gray sweats moisture but holds weight. Cut your ceiling into the blue-gray and your walls through the red. The blue-gray is your roof." Cole took the clay piece and put it in his pocket. He came back 3 days later with a shovel and his oldest boy, and Eliza marked a spot on a clay bank behind his repaired kitchen where the soil was right and the angle faced south-southeast. Mercy Cole came next. She did not come to learn about dugouts. She came to stand in the entrance and look at the room where her children had survived and to say something she had been composing since dawn. "I told you damp walls would sicken Ruth. I told you the roof would cave. I told you no decent family could live like badgers." She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "Lottie has her fingers because of this room. Darren is not dead because of this room. I was wrong about every part of it that mattered." Eliza said, "You were not wrong about the damp walls. They do weep. I just found a way to manage it before it managed us." Mercy reached into her coat and pulled out a jar of preserves, the same kind she had been sending Lottie to deliver when the storm hit. She set it on the clay bench. "What do you need?" Mercy asked. "Straw, as much as you can spare, and lamp oil and dry socks. This room needs a storm supply that does not depend on anyone remembering to bring it." Mercy nodded. She came back that evening with straw, oil, 2 pairs of wool socks, and a crock of lard. She did not call it charity. She called it payment. 3 families came in the following week. Each one had a different situation, different soil, different bank angle, different resources. And Eliza adapted her advice to each. She did not give them a single plan. She gave them a method of reading their own ground. "Test your clay before you trust it," she told a woman named Haas, whose summer kitchen had collapsed. "Dig a pilot hole, set a water cup inside, wait overnight. If the water does not freeze, you have enough thermal mass to work with. If it freezes, you need to go deeper or find a different bank." The measurable results emerged within weeks. Families who added earth-backed rooms to their existing structures reported fuel savings that were impossible to ignore. A frame cabin with a banked rear room burned roughly half the wood on still nights. During wind, the difference was even more dramatic. The frame walls leaked heat through every gap and seam, while the earth wall behind them held steady. Vale confirmed the numbers. He walked 5 properties with his square and his thermometer, and recorded the differences. Outside temperature 4 degrees. Frame room 26 degrees with the stove running. Banked room behind the frame 39 degrees with the same stove. The earth wall was doing what Eliza's father had told her it would do, holding its temperature while the air above it argued with the sky. Rufus Baird's initial response to the storm was humiliation dressed in accounting. He appeared at the dugout on January 16th, 2 days after Vale's public admission. His store had lost the rear roof. The ledger books from the bank room had frozen together in a block of ice and paper. His flower stores were ruined. His dignity was worse. He stood outside the entrance. He did not come inside, would not stoop through the low door, and offered Eliza store credit for the night's shelter. $5 credit, he said, applied against any purchase at the mercantile, as thanks for the accommodation. Eliza looked at him. She was holding the shovel she used to clear the entrance each morning. Her coat was patched with canvas. Her boots were cracked. She looked like what she was, a woman who had dug a house with her hands and survived a killing storm in it while the man in front of her lost his roof. "I do not want credit," she said. Baird's eyebrows lifted. "Then what do you want?" "Thomas's auger. The wagon bows he made for the spring cart. 2 panes of glass. You took them as collateral against the note." "The note was legal, Mrs. Marden. The collateral was legally seized." "The note is also satisfied, Mr. Baird. Thomas owed $186.40. The farm was worth more than that. You took the farm, the team, and the tools. The debt is clear." Baird's jaw worked. He was a man accustomed to controlling conversations, and this one had left his control before the second sentence. Vale appeared behind him. He had been walking the perimeter of the dugout, checking the bank for cracks. He said, without turning, "Legality did not keep your roof on, Rufus." Baird looked at Vale. He looked at Eliza. He looked at the entrance to the dugout, and for a moment something moved behind his eyes. Not shame exactly, but a recognition that the geometry of power in this valley had shifted overnight, and he was standing on the wrong side of the line. "I will have the tools delivered," he said. He turned and walked to his buggy. Ruth, watching from inside the entrance, said, "He did not apologize." "He will not," Eliza said. "He will adjust. That is what men like Baird do. They do not admit they were wrong. They rearrange until they appear to have been right from a different angle." Barbara Flatten arrived on January 18th, 6 days after the storm. She drove her wagon slowly because the road was still rutted with frozen drifts, and when she climbed down at the Marden parcel, Eliza saw that her cheeks were burned dark red from frostbite, and her right hand was bandaged. "Your sod house," Eliza said. "Held," Barbara said. "The root cellar held better. I spent the worst hours in the cellar with the goat and a candle. The goat was not pleased." She walked to the entrance and looked inside. She saw the clay bench, the sleeping shelf, the stove still burning, the vent drawing smoke upward, the drainage trenches dry. She pressed her palm against the ceiling and dragged it along the arch the way she had taught Eliza to do. "3 cracks," she said. "Hairline. They will stabilize. Pack them with damp clay and straw, and they will hold until spring." Then she walked back outside and found Eliza teaching 3 men, Cole, a neighbor named Haas, and the old man Pell, who had been led to the dugout by his dog, how to cut a drainage trench with the proper slope and gravel pocket. Barbara watched this for a moment. Then she laughed. Once, a short, hard sound like a stone dropped on a table, and then she sat down on the clay pile because she was exhausted, and her legs would not hold her any longer. Eliza went to her. She knelt beside the wagon wheel and looked at Barbara's face and saw something she had not seen before, The full cost of the storm written in the older woman's skin, the frostbite, the sleeplessness, the hours alone in a cellar with a goat, listening to wind try to disassemble the world. You should have come here, Eliza said. 7 miles in that wind? I would not have made it past the creek. After. You should have come after. I came now. That is when I could. Barbara rested for an hour. She ate beans and cornbread that Ruth had cooked on the stove. Then she stood and joined the men at the drainage trench. She did not teach the way Eliza taught. Eliza explained principles, why the trench sloped, why the gravel pocket worked, why the angle mattered. Barbara demonstrated. She picked up a shovel and cut a trench in 4 minutes that took the men 20. She did not tell them what she was doing. She made them watch, and then she made them do it. And when they did it wrong, she did it again until they could see the difference. Norwegian turf, she said to Eliza while the men dug. The grass roots, if you lay them down and overlap them like shingles, shed water better than any daub. The roots mat together as they dry. In 3 months, you have a skin that breathes but does not leak. Show me. Barbara showed her. She cut sawed squares from the prairie, flipped them grass side down, and layered them over a section of the entry hood, overlapping each piece by 3 inches. The grass roots, dense, fibrous, clinging to the earth, created a mesh that water would run across rather than through. My husband's mother taught me this, Barbara said. In Hardanger, the turf roofs lasted decades because the women laid them correctly. The men built the frames. The women made the roofs live. This was the moment when teacher and pupil became collaborators. Barbara had given Eliza the knowledge to survive. Now Eliza was giving Barbara something in return, a place where that knowledge mattered, where it was being asked for, where it was changing lives instead of sitting in the memory of a woman who lived 7 miles from the nearest human voice. They worked together through the afternoon. By dusk, the entry hood had a new turf layer, and 3 men had drainage trenches that would actually drain. Ruth's fever broke on January 20th. The infection in her hand had not cleared. The red streak still climbed past her wrist, but the heat in her body had subsided to a low simmer rather than a boil. She could sit up without dizziness. She could hold a cup. She could not grip a shovel, but she could hold a willow wand and scribe ceiling curves for the men who came asking how to shape an arch. She became, without intending it, the best ceiling shaver in the valley. Her hands, smaller, more sensitive than the men's rough palms, could feel a flat spot in the curve before seeing it. She would press her fingertips against the clay and say, "Here, too flat. Take an inch." The men would shave where she pointed, and the curve would improve, and they would look at her with the expression people wear when a child corrects them, and they know the child is right. Barbara noticed this. She gave Ruth the willow measuring wand she had brought from her husband's workshop, a straight willow branch, stripped and dried, marked with notches at 6-inch intervals. It was the tool Barbara used to check arch height and trench depth. Giving it to Ruth was not a gesture. It was a transfer. "You feel the clay better than your mother," Barbara said. "Different gift. Same listening." Ruth held the wand and ran her thumb along the notches. She did not thank Barbara. She put the wand in her belt and went back to work. February came cold and stayed cold. The dugout performed through it the way a well-built tool performs through use, not flawlessly, but reliably. The ceiling cracks that Barbara had identified stabilized after packing. The drainage trenches handled 2 snowmelts without flooding. The vent drew consistently except during the strongest north winds, when Eliza had to partially block it and accept a smokier room for an hour. Barbara came every 4 or 5 days. She and Eliza worked on improvements, a whitewash of lime and clay on the interior walls to reflect lamplight, a muslin cloth tacked against the ceiling to catch dust and condensation drips before they fell on bedding, a stone-lined sump near the door to collect boot mud and snow melt. They argued about the second exit. "You still have not cut it," Barbaro said on February 8th, standing at the rear wall with her palm flat against the clay. "I know. If the entrance collapses, a heavy snow, a spring mudslide, a rotten post, you're trapped." "I know." "Then cut it." Eliza hesitated. The rear exit meant tunneling through the densest part of the bank, 6 feet of clay at the thickest point, angling upward to emerge above the dugout on the flat of the prairie. It was 3 days of work at minimum, and those 3 days would come from time she needed for other improvements. The sleeping shelf needed a second layer of straw. The stove platform was cracking from heat cycling. The entry hood needed Barbaro's turf treatment on the remaining sections. "I will cut it in March," Eliza said. "March is late. Spring thaw loosens banks. The clay that holds now may not hold when the frost leaves it." "Then I will cut it in February." "When?" Eliza looked at the rear wall. She looked at her hands, cracked, scarred, calloused in places that had been smooth 6 months ago. She looked at Ruth, who was sitting on the bench reading a page of newspaper that someone had used to wrap nails. "Tomorrow," Eliza said. Barbaro nodded. "I will bring my goat. She eats less than a man and complains only about the weather." They cut the rear exit over 4 days, February 9th through the 12th. Ruth could not dig, but she cleared the spoiled clay from the tunnel mouth as Eliza and Barbaro alternated strokes. The tunnel was 3 feet wide, 3 feet high, and angled upward at roughly 30 degrees. It emerged 12 feet behind the dugout on the flat above the bank, covered with a sod cap that could be pushed off from inside. When it was done, Eliza crawled through it and stood on the flat in the February wind and looked down at the entry hood below. 2 ways in, 2 ways out. The hill no longer owned them. Barbaro stood beside her. The wind pulled at their coats. The sky was white and low. "Now it is a house," Barbaro said. The cough started in late February. Barbaro had always coughed in winter, a dry, persistent bark that she attributed to dust from the sod and the dry air of the stove. But this cough was different. It was wet. It came from deeper. It left her breathless in a way that the dry cough never had. She did not mention it to Eliza. She came on her regular visits and worked with her usual intensity, but Eliza noticed that she rested more often, that she sat on the clay pile between tasks and pressed her hand against her chest, that her face had lost the ruddy color of the frostbite and replaced it with something gray. On March 2nd, Barbaro arrived and could not climb down from the wagon without help. Ruth brought a stool. Barbaro sat on it in the weak spring sunlight and said, "The cold got inside me during the storm. It has not left." Eliza knew what this meant. On the frontier, a winter cough that turned wet and would not clear was consumption or pneumonia or something in between, and the treatment was warmth, rest, food, and time. And sometimes all 4 were not enough. "Stay here," Eliza said. "The dugout is warmer than your sod house." "My goat." "Bring the goat. Ruth will milk it. Stay." Barbaro stayed for 11 days. She slept on the bench because the sleeping shelf was Ruth's, and Barbaro would not take a child's bed. Eliza patted the bench with straw and blankets and placed a hot stone wrapped in cloth against Barbaro's back each night. The dugout held its steady temperature, 38, 40, 39, and the clay walls did not argue with the air, and Barbaro's cough improved slightly in the first week. But it did not clear. On March 8th, Barbaro sat up in the night and coughed for 20 minutes without stopping. Eliza held a cloth to her mouth, and when Barbaro pulled it away, there was blood on it. Not much, a few spots, but enough. Ruth saw it. She looked at Eliza. Neither of them spoke. Barbara looked at the cloth herself. She folded it and put it in her pocket. She said, I have been cold before. I have always come back. I will come back from this. She did not come back from this. Barbara Flatten died on March 13th, 1888, in the early morning. In the dugout, she had taught Eliza to build correctly. She died quietly. The cough stopped first, which seemed like improvement until Eliza realized the silence was not recovery, but exhaustion, the body giving up the effort of fighting. Barbara's last clear words spoken to Ruth the evening before were about the willow wand. Keep the notches clean. Dirt in the notches throws off the measurement. Eliza and Ruth carried her out through the rear exit, the exit Barbara had demanded and Eliza had delayed, and laid her on the flat above the bank. The ground was frozen too hard for a proper grave, so Orrin Cole brought a pickaxe and two of his boys, and they broke through the frost layer together. It took most of the day. They lined the grave with prairie grass because the ground was too hard for flowers and the season was too early for anything to be growing. Ruth placed the willow wand on top of the grass, and Eliza took it back and put it in Ruth's hand. She gave it to you, Eliza said. You keep it. Ruth held the wand. She did not cry. She counted the notches with her thumb, 6 of them, each one a measurement Barbara had taught her, and then she put it in her belt where it had lived since the day Barbara had handed it over. The woman who taught them to trust the earth returned to it under a sky so clear it seemed empty, as if the weather had finally made up its mind to be still, just once, just long enough for the ground to receive what it was owed. Spring came slowly to Custer County in 1888, and it brought problems that winter had hidden. The thaw began in late March. Snow melted. The frozen ground softened. Water that had been locked in ice for 3 months began to move, downhill, through soil, into every low point and cavity that the ground offered. Cellars that had been dry all winter flooded. Banks that had held solid in the frost began to weep and shift. On April 3rd, the poorly built storm cellar behind Ned Kroll's livery stable began to slump. Kroll had built it in February, copying what he had seen of Eliza's dugout, but omitting the details he considered unnecessary. He had skipped the drainage trenches because digging them was tedious. He had cut the ceiling flat because shaping an arch took skill he did not have. He had used cottonwood cross pieces instead of the willow lattice because cottonwood was available, and willow required cutting and stripping. And he had not consulted Eliza because consulting the woman whose shelter he had mocked was a concession his pride would not make. The result was a box cut into sandy clay with a flat ceiling, no drainage, and rigid cross pieces that could not flex when the earth moved. When the thaw water found the cellar, it had nowhere to go. It pooled on the floor. It seeped into the ceiling clay from above, where snow melt saturated the ground surface. The flat ceiling, already under stress from the rigid cross pieces, began to sag. The sandy clay, the wrong clay, the kind that crumbled instead of holding, lost cohesion as it absorbed moisture. Ruth heard about it from Darren Cole, who heard the crosspieces cracking from the road. She ran to the livery. She pressed her hand against the outside of the bank and felt something Barbara had described but she had never experienced. The clay was ticking, not audibly, through her fingertips, a series of tiny shifts, each one a fiber of clay releasing its grip on the fiber beside it. Individually, nothing. Together, a ceiling preparing to come down. "Get out," Ruth said. Kroll was inside with a lantern trying to prop the sagging ceiling with a board. "The prop will hold," he said. "The clay is ticking. The ceiling is not sagging. It is separating. You have 30 seconds, or you have a grave." Kroll looked at her. He saw a 15-year-old girl with a willow wand in her belt and clay under her fingernails and an expression that was not frightened but certain. He decided to believe her. He came out. The ceiling dropped 40 seconds later. Not all of it, the rear third. The section where the sandy clay was worst and the drainage was most absent. It came down in a single slab, 300 pounds of wet earth, and it crushed the board Kroll had been propping against it like a boot stepping on a matchstick. Kroll stared at the collapsed cellar. He stared at Ruth. How did you know? The clay told me. You were not listening. This was the moment that could have turned the community against dugouts entirely. A collapse, a near death, a visible failure. These were the things Mercy Cole had warned about, the things Vale had predicted, the things Baird would use. But the failure was not the method. The failure was the execution. Kroll had built without drainage, without an arch, without proper clay selection, without the knowledge that turned a hole in the ground into a shelter. He had copied the shape and ignored the sense. Eliza arrived an hour later. She examined the collapse. She dug through the debris and found what she expected. Sandy red clay with no blue-gray support, no drainage path, flat ceiling, rigid cross pieces wedged so tight they had cracked rather than flexed. This is not what I built, she said, standing in front of Kroll and 6 men who had gathered to see the damage. It is a dugout, Kroll said. A dugout is not a hole. A hole is what you dig when you do not understand what you are digging. Drainage, arch, clay selection, flexible lattice, ventilation. Each one of these exists because the earth requires it. You left out 3 of the 5. The earth does not negotiate. 5 families stood around that collapsed cellar and understood for the first time that the knowledge mattered as much as the labor. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the weather asks. Kroll said nothing. He looked at the collapsed cellar and then at the road that led to the Marden parcel, where the dugout he had mocked was still standing with its arch intact and its trenches draining the spring melt exactly as designed. The lesson was harsh but clear. Earth shelter was not a shortcut. It was a discipline. The material was free, but the understanding was not, and the understanding was what made the difference between a shelter and a tomb. Rufus Baird saw opportunity in the collapse. Within a week of Kroll's failure, Baird had printed handbills, neat, professional, typeset at the county press, advertising Baird's patent storm cellars. The handbills offered plans for a banked storm room, engineered for safety and permanence, for $3 per household. The plans included dimensions, materials, and placement instructions. They did not include drainage details. They did not include clay selection guidance. They did not include arch specifications. They did not include ventilation. They included the parts that looked impressive on paper and omitted the parts that kept people alive. Because including those parts would have required acknowledging where the knowledge came from, and Rufus Baird was not prepared to acknowledge that a widow with 2 shovels had engineered something he was now selling. Eliza learned about the handbills from Mercy, who had been shown one by a neighbor. He has taken your work, Mercy said. He has taken the shape of my work. He has left out the things that make it work. What will you do? Eliza looked at Ruth, who was sitting on the bench sharpening the mattock blade, the same blade that had started this, the same blade that had dug the first stroke into the clay bank 5 months earlier. I will wait, Eliza said. Ruth looked up. Wait for what? For his cellar to teach him what mine taught me. Ruth understood. She went back to the mattock. The blade rang against the stone with a sound that carried across the flat and disappeared into the prairie, where the grass was beginning to turn green again, and the clay banks stood in the late light, looking like what they had always been. Not obstacles, not resources, not shelter, but earth, waiting to be understood by anyone patient enough to listen. Baird's patent storm cellar stood behind the mercantile like a monument to confidence unearned. He had hired 2 men from town to build it over 6 days in late April, using his own hand-built plans, and he had invited anyone who cared to watch. The dimensions were correct, 12 by 16, cut into a gentle bank behind the store. The front wall was framed with milled lumber, which Baird considered an improvement over Eliza's scavenged cottonwood. The ceiling was flat cottonwood crosspieces laid side by side, covered with sod. He had skipped the drainage trenches because he believed the gentle slope of the bank was sufficient. He had built the ceiling flat because the arch, in his assessment, was an aesthetic choice rather than a structural one. He had used rigid crosspieces wedged tight against the walls because rigid construction meant stable construction. This was the logic of a man who understood buildings and did not understand earth. He charged visitors 50 cents to tour it. He sold 11 copies of the hand-built plans at $3 each. He told customers it was the safest room in the valley. Eliza said nothing. She did not visit the cellar. She did not comment on the plans. She did not warn Baird. Ruth asked her why. "Because he will not listen to me," Eliza said. "He will listen to the clay." Through the summer and into the fall of 1888, Baird's cellar stood without incident. The weather was dry. The bank did not move. The flat ceiling held because dry clay holds everything. It is water that teaches you whether you built correctly. The first test came in November of 1889 during a hard freeze, followed by a sudden thaw and 3 days of sleet. Eliza knew the sequence was dangerous because Barbaro had described it to her during one of their last working afternoons together. Freeze, thaw, wet. The freeze locked water in the clay. The thaw released it. The sleet added more. The clay became saturated from above and unstable from within. Any structure without drainage would hold the water instead of shedding it, and saturated clay under load did not hold. It moved. She watched the sky. She tracked the temperature with Barbaro's thermometer, which Ruth had hung inside the dugout on a nail above the bench. She noted when the sleet began and calculated how long it would take for meltwater to penetrate the surface and reach the ceiling clay of any unlined cellar. On the second day of sleet, she walked into Broken Bow. Baird's cellar was open. 3 customers were inside examining stored goods. Baird had begun using the rear section for overflow flour and dry stock. 2 children were playing near the entrance. Baird himself was at the counter in the store, separated from the cellar by the building and the bank. Eliza went to the cellar entrance and looked inside. She did not enter. She placed her hand flat against the outside of the bank, the way Barbaro had taught her, the way Ruth had done at Kroll's livery. The clay was not ticking, not yet, but the back wall was weeping, a slow, steady seep that had no drainage trench to catch it. Water was pooling against the base of the rear wall, darkening the floor in a crescent that grew wider as she watched. Above the seep, the flat ceiling was holding its weight, but the cottonwood crosspieces were dark with absorbed moisture, and where they met the side walls, the wedge joints had begun to separate, a gap no wider than a fingernail, but visible. Eliza walked into the store. "Mr. Baird, your cellar's taking water." Baird looked up from his ledger. His expression was the one he wore for inconvenient customers, patient, faintly condescending, ready to be done. "It is sleet, Mrs. Marden. Everything is taking water." "Your back wall is seeping. Your crosspieces are wet. The wedge joints are separating." "The cellar was built to withstand weather. It has stood for 6 months." "It has stood for 6 months of dry weather. This is the first wet load it has taken. You have no drainage. The water has nowhere to go except into the clay and into the wood. Baird closed the ledger. He looked at Eliza with the expression of a man who is being told something he does not want to hear by the last person he wants to hear it from. I appreciate your concern, he said. The cellar is sound. Eliza held his gaze. Get the people out. Mrs. Marden, get the children out. If I am wrong, you have lost nothing. If you are wrong, you have killed someone else's child in a room you charge them money to enter. Something in her voice, not anger, not pleading, but the flat certainty of a woman who had spent a winter listening to Clay speak, reached past Baird's pride and touched the part of him that could still calculate risk. He walked to the cellar entrance. He told the customers and children to step outside. He said the floor was wet, and he wanted to inspect it before anyone slipped. The ceiling dropped 9 minutes later. Not all of it. The rear third, the section above the seeping wall, where the saturated clay had been carrying the weight of the flat cross pieces and the sod above them, and the accumulated sleet above that. The cross pieces snapped first. 2 of them, the ones whose wedge joints had separated, twisted loose and fell. The clay above them, unsupported, sagged for a moment that felt like held breath, and then let go. 300 pounds of wet earth and splintered cottonwood hit the floor of Baird's cellar where, 4 minutes earlier, 2 children had been standing. The sound brought people from the store. They stood at the entrance and looked at the mess: clay, wood, sod, flour from the burst sacks, all of it mixed together in a heap that filled the rear half of the room. The air was thick with dust and the smell of wet earth. Baird stood at the entrance and said nothing for a very long time. Vale arrived. He looked at the collapse. He looked at the intact front section, where the cross pieces had held because they were closer to the entrance and less saturated. He looked at the rear, where the failure had happened exactly where failure happens when you build without drainage, without an arch, without flexible lattice, without any of the things that Eliza had learned from Barbro, and Barbro had learned from the earth itself. You sold the shape and left out the sense, Vale said. Baird's face was gray, not with anger, with the recognition that 2 children had been standing in the path of 300 pounds of clay 9 minutes before it fell, and that the only reason they were alive was that a woman he had spent a year dismissing had walked into his store and told him to clear the room. He turned to Eliza. She was standing near the entrance with her arms folded. She was not smiling. She was not angry. She was tired. She had been tired for a year. You knew? He said. I knew the signs. The clay tells you before it moves. You have to be willing to hear it. Why did you come? Because children were inside. Baird looked at the collapsed ceiling. He looked at the intact front section. He looked at his hands, which were soft and clean and had never dug anything in his life. What do I owe you? He said. It was the first honest question Rufus Baird had asked Eliza Marden since the day he had stood at her excavation and offered $25 for her land. Eliza said, return Thomas's remaining tools. Cancel the deficiency claim against the old farm surplus, and pay me $16 to mark a proper public storm room near the schoolhouse, one that drains, one that arches, one that will hold when everything you built will not. Baird nodded. He did not haggle. He reached into his coat and counted bills. $16, he said. He held them out. Eliza took them. She folded them and put them in her coat pocket, the same pocket where, 13 months earlier, she had carried $9.70 in a deed to 40 acres of rock and clay. Ruth, standing behind her mother, said nothing, but she touched the willow wand in her belt, the way another person might touch a cross or a coin, not for luck, but for memory. Baird never apologized cleanly. In the weeks that followed, he returned Thomas's tools, the auger, the wagon bows, 2 panes of glass, and he filed a paper at the county office canceling the deficiency claim. He did these things without ceremony and without acknowledgement. The closest he came to an apology was a sentence spoken to Eliza in the store 3 weeks later while she was buying lamp oil and salt. "You knew what I did not," he said. Eliza set the oil can on the counter. "No," she said. "I learned what you would not." Baird did not respond. He wrapped the oil can in paper and tied it with string, the way he wrapped everything, and Eliza carried it home to the dugout on the clay bank where the wind passed over the roof and the drainage trenches ran clear and the willow wand hung on a nail beside the thermometer. Jonah Pike came to Broken Bow in the spring of 1889, driving a wagon loaded with forge tools, anvil stock, and a temperament that matched the iron he worked. Heated slowly, shaped with patience, and hard to break once set. He was 41. Widowed 3 years. His first wife had died of typhoid in Mason City, Iowa, and he had stayed long enough to settle her affairs and sell the house before leaving for the West because staying meant living in rooms that still held her voice. He was not a large man, but he was dense, short-armed, thick through the chest and shoulders, with hands that could close around a hammer handle and stay closed for 12 hours. He set up his forge in a lean-to behind the livery, the same livery where Kroll's cellar had collapsed, and within 2 weeks he had more work than he could finish because the valley had broken things that needed mending, and winter had broken more of them. Eliza met him on the 6th day after his arrival. Her stove collar, the one she had sealed with Barbro's spruce pitch, had cracked again. The pitch held the smoke, but the iron beneath it was warped beyond what pitch could compensate for, and the joint leaked a thin whistle of cold air that drove her to distraction on still nights when every other sound had stopped. She brought the collar to the forge and set it on Pike's workbench. He picked it up and turned it in his hands. He ran his thumb along the crack. He held it up to the light and sighted along the edge the way a carpenter sights along a board. "Who repaired this?" he said. "I did. Spruce pitch and tin." "The pitch is good work. The tin is good work. But the iron is finished. You cannot repair a warp this deep. You need a new collar." "I cannot afford a new collar." Pike set the old collar down. He looked at Eliza, not at her clothes, which were patched, or her boots, which were cracked, but at her hands, which were calloused and scarred in patterns that told him everything he needed to know about how she had spent the last year. "I will make you one," he said. "In exchange, I need someone to mark a bank for me. I want a root cellar behind the forge. The livery owner says there is a woman who knows clay." "There is." "Are you her?" "I am." Pike made the collar that afternoon. It was not beautiful work. He was a blacksmith, not a silversmith, but it was precise. The iron was the right gauge. The joint was the right diameter. The flange sat flat against the stovepipe with no gap, no whistle, no leak. Eliza installed it that evening. The stove drew perfectly for the first time since she had dragged it to the parcel on a handcart 13 months earlier. Ruth sat on the bench and listened to the silence where the whistle had been and said, "That is the sound of someone who knows what they are making." Eliza marked the bank behind Pike's forge the following week. She tested the clay, selected the site, scribed the entrance angle, and showed him where to cut. Pike dug it himself. He was strong enough to excavate alone, and he worked with the controlled intensity of a man who was accustomed to shaping resistant material. But he did not know clay the way Eliza did, and he did not pretend to. He asked questions. He asked why the arch curved where it did. He asked why the drainage trench needed gravel instead of just depth. He asked why the ceiling needed flexible lattice instead of rigid cross pieces. He listened to the answers the way he listened to iron, with his full attention and without interrupting. When the cellar was finished, he stood inside it and pressed his palm against the ceiling arch and said, "This is good work." Eliza said, "This is Barbro's work. I am delivering it." "Who is Barbro?" "The woman who taught me to listen to clay. She died in March." Pike was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The best teachers leave you able to work without them. That is how you know they taught you the right things." Eliza looked at him. He was standing in the cellar she had marked, in the light from the entrance, with forged soot on his forearms and a hammer still hanging from his belt loop. He had not told her she was brave. He had not told her she was remarkable. He had told her the things she needed to hear, that Barbro's teaching had worked, and that working without Barbro was not abandonment but graduation. The courtship, if it could be called that, developed through labor. Pike repaired the entry hood hinges, proper iron hinges, forged to fit the low door, with pins that would not rust because he had treated them with linseed oil. He built a storm door for the rear exit, a low iron-banded oak panel that could be barred from inside. He forged stove grates and ash tools and a pot hook that swung on a pivot so Ruth could move the Dutch oven without burning her hands. Each piece arrived at the dugout as a trade: metalwork for clay marking, hinges for bank assessment, storm door for root cellar consultation. Neither of them called it courtship. Ruth called it courtship, but only to Mercy Cole's oldest daughter, and only after swearing her to secrecy, which lasted approximately 4 hours. What mattered to Eliza was not that Pike was kind, though he was. What mattered was that he respected Ruth's measurements. When Ruth scribed a ceiling curve, Pike did not adjust it. When Eliza altered a design, Pike asked why before suggesting alternatives. He did not call the dugout temporary. He did not mention frame cabins. He did not suggest that what they had was less than what they needed. He entered their world on its own terms and offered his skills without conditions. They married in the spring of 1891 in the schoolhouse storm room that Eliza had marked and the community had built. A banked earth room behind the schoolhouse large enough for 30 children, with drainage, an arch, a flexible lattice, and a turf-covered entry hood that Mercy Cole maintained because Mercy had become, without intending it, the person who taught women how to store dry socks and lamp oil in sealed crocks for storm supply. The ceremony was brief. Vale stood as witness. Ruth held the willow wand. Pike moved his forge tools to the Marden parcel and built a small frame room against the front of the dugout, not replacing it, but extending it. The original chamber remained behind the frame room, cool in summer and steady in winter, the earth walls still holding its temperature, the way Martin Weller had shown his daughter it would 40 years earlier in a Pennsylvania cellar. The valley changed in the way that valleys change when knowledge spreads through practice rather than instruction, or slowly, unevenly, but permanently. By the winter of 1891, 9 claims within 12 miles of Broken Bow had some form of banked room, root cellar, or storm dugout. Not all of them were good. Not all of them followed Eliza's principles, but enough of them did that when the next hard winter came. And on the plains, the next hard winter always came. Fewer families lost roofs, fewer children walked through blizzards to reach shelter, and fewer stoves burned through 5 cords of wood trying to heat a box that the wind was emptying as fast as the fire could fill. The schoolhouse storm room was the most visible change. Eliza had marked it. Cole and Vale had dug it. Pike had forged the hinges and the storm door. Mercy had stocked it with blankets, lamp oil, matches, dried food, and 3 pairs of children's socks in graduated sizes. Ruth had scribed the ceiling curve, the same shallow arch, the same willow wand measurement, the same listening that Barbro had taught her. Every school term began with a storm drill. The teacher, a woman named Goss, who had arrived from Omaha and found the drill peculiar until her first plains blizzard convinced her otherwise, would ring the bell 3 times and the children would file into the storm room and sit along the benches and count heads. Ruth, who was 18 now, came twice a year to check the ceiling and the drainage and the vent. She ran her fingers along the arch and pressed her palm flat against the clay and listened for the tick that meant trouble was coming. She never heard it. The arch held. The drainage ran. The vent drew. Eliza taught through demonstration rather than lecture the way Barbro had taught her. When a family came asking for help, she walked their land with them. She tested their clay. She marked their bank. She showed them the pilot hole test. The 2 cups, one inside, one outside, overnight, and let the water tell them what she already knew. I cannot give you my ground, she said to a man named Haas who wanted a cellar exactly like Eliza's. Your clay is different. Your bank faces northeast. Your drainage needs to run the opposite direction from mine. You must learn your own earth. I can teach you how to listen, but I cannot listen for you. This was the hardest lesson, that the method was not a plan to be copied, but a practice to be learned. Kroll's collapse had proven what happened when you copied without understanding. Baird's failure had proven what happened when you sold without knowledge. The earth did not care about plans or money or pride. The earth cared about drainage, arch, clay, and air, and it would kill you for ignoring any one of them. Pike added his own contribution. He forged standard storm door hardware, hinges, bars, pins, in sets that he sold for $2.50. The price covered his iron and coal costs and left him a small margin. He did not patent the design. He did not print handbills. He made the hardware and sold it to anyone who asked, and when someone could not pay, he traded for labor or food or the promise of help when he needed it. Eliza and Pike were not wealthy. The 40 acres of rock and clay did not become a prosperous farm. The grazing never improved much. The creek bed ran water only in spring and fall. What the land gave them was shelter, and what the shelter gave them was time. Time to teach, time to build, time to raise Ruth into a woman who could feel a ceiling crack before it moved, and who kept a notebook of soil types, frost depth observations, fuel consumption, and failures that she added to every season. Ruth's notebook was not a scientific document. It was a working record. This clay held. This clay cracked. This bank faced south and stayed dry. This bank faced west and flooded. She recorded temperatures the way her mother had recorded them, with Barbro's thermometer, which still hung on its nail inside the dugout. She recorded fuel use. This cord lasted this many weeks in the frame room. This half cord lasted the same period in the earth room. She recorded failures. This family skipped drainage and lost their floor. This family used sandy clay and lost their ceiling. This family blocked their vent and poisoned their air. The notebook was teaching material. When Ruth took over the storm drills at the schoolhouse, she brought it with her and showed the older children the records. She did not lecture. She opened the notebook and said, "This is what happens when you listen. This is what happens when you do not." The years compress the way years do when the crisis has passed, and the life that follows is built from daily work rather than daily survival. Pike and Eliza had a son in 1892, a boy they named Martin after Eliza's father, the canal digger who had pressed his daughter's hand against a cellar wall and told her the earth was slower than the weather. Martin grew up in a house that was half frame and half earth, and he never found this strange because he had never known anything else. Ruth became the schoolhouse teacher in 1894, replacing the woman from Omaha who returned east after 2 winters. Ruth taught reading, arithmetic, geography, and storm preparedness with equal emphasis, because on the plains all 4 were survival skills. She kept Barbro's willow wand above the schoolhouse door, where the children could see it but not reach it. When they asked what it was, she told them it was a measuring tool that belonged to a woman who listened to clay. Hiram Vale, who had once measured everything with a steel square and believed that straight lines were the only lines worth drawing, began marking dugout arches for poorer settlers who could not afford Eliza's time or Pike's hardware. He did it without charging. He said it was penance, though he did not say for what. Everyone knew. Mercy Cole became the valley's authority on storm supply. She kept a list, updated each fall, of every household storm provisions, blankets, lamp oil, matches, dry food, dry socks, sealed crocks of water. She visited each house and checked the list against the stores, and God help the family that had let their lamp oil run low or their matches get damp. Mercy had watched her daughter's fingers turn white in a blizzard, and she would never again be unprepared, and she would not allow anyone she could reach to be unprepared either. Ned Kroll rebuilt his cellar correctly. He asked Eliza to mark it. He asked Ruth to scribe the ceiling. He asked Pike to forge the hardware. He dug the drainage trenches himself, deeper than necessary, because he had stood in the path of a collapsing ceiling and he understood in his body what his mind had resisted, that the earth gave you exactly what you earned and nothing more. Baird continued to run the mercantile. He did not become generous. He did not become kind. He became careful, which was the closest a man like Baird could come to wisdom. He never again sold plans for something he had not built himself. He never again skipped drainage. He stocked storm supplies alongside the dry goods and lamp oil, and he kept a list of prices that were fair, if not friendly, and he accepted trade from families who could not pay cash, which was a concession he would not have made before his ceiling fell, and a woman he had dismissed saved his customers' children. He and Eliza maintained a relationship that was functional rather than warm. He nodded to her in the store. She bought her salt and oil from his counter. They did not discuss the storm or the collapse or the $25 he had once offered for her land. These things existed between them like a wall that both could see through, but neither would dismantle. Eliza Marden Pike lived out her later years on the same 40 acres that Rufus Baird had tried to buy for the price of 2 train tickets. The frame room grew slowly. A second room added in 93, a porch in 95, a proper chimney in 97, but the original dugout chamber remained behind it, unchanged except for the whitewash that Ruth refreshed each spring and the muslin ceiling cloth that Eliza replaced every 2 years. In summer, the dugout was the coolest room on the property. The children napped there on August afternoons when the prairie heat pressed down like a hand. In winter, the dugout was the steadiest room, holding its temperature while the frame room swung with the weather. Eliza stored food there, potatoes, carrots, crocks of sauerkraut, the way her father had stored food in his Pennsylvania cellar, the way people had stored food underground since before anyone thought to write it down. She lived long enough to see the valley forget why the dugouts mattered. That was the nature of successful knowledge. It dissolved into habit, and habit forgot its origins. Families banked their rooms without remembering why. Children practiced storm drills without knowing who had started them. The word dugout became ordinary, which was the highest compliment Eliza's work could receive because ordinary meant permanent. Pike died in 1903 at the forge, finishing a set of hinges for a neighbor's storm door. His heart stopped between one hammer stroke and the next. Eliza found him still holding the hammer, the iron still warm on the anvil. She lived 7 more years. She died in the dugout, in winter, on the sleeping shelf that Ruth had scribed and Barbro had approved, and the clay had held for 22 years without a single collapse. The thermometer on the wall read 41 degrees. Outside, the wind was blowing. By the time the worst winter stories had settled into memory, the valley no longer laughed at low doors and earth walls. 9 families had earth-backed rooms. The schoolhouse had a storm chamber that held 30 children. Veil marked arches, mercy stocked provisions. Ruth kept the notebook. The knowledge spread not as invention, but as corrected attention. People had seen banks and cellars and sod and clay all their lives, and Eliza had made them see what those things could do when weather turned hostile. Eliza Marden Pike lived and died on the 40 acres Thomas had bought for grazing and never cleared. A small frame room stood against the dugout front, but the original chamber remained behind it, cool in summer, steady in winter, the clay walls still holding the earth's own temperature while the air above argued with the sky. Ruth kept Barbro Flatten's willow wand above the schoolhouse door until the school closed in 1912. The notches were still clean. The wind that January night in 1888 had passed over the clay bank the way it passed over everything low and buried and close to the ground. Inside, 14 people had breathed air that tasted like smoke and sweat and damp earth. And they had lived. Hiram Vale's hand, which had measured straight lumber for 40 years, pressed flat against Eliza's curved clay wall. Mercy Cole's children slept under quilts along the bench. Rufus Baird sat silent beside the stove, his blue lips warming, his gloves gone, his store open to the sky. Ruth lay on the sleeping shelf, feverish but alive, counting breaths the way she had once counted shovelfuls, one at a time, each one proof that the next was possible. Mole women, the men had called them. The wind had passed over them because Eliza Marden had learned what the town forgot. Sometimes the strongest house on the prairie was the one that refused to stand above it,